Chapter 4767. For Ji Tianxing, a month passed by very quickly. He had just finished setting up several dozen formations and rested for 3 days when his target appeared. During this period of time, there would be Divine King experts arriving at Autumn Wind Ridge from all directions every day. Those people were the hall masters, scouts, generals, and so on of the various branches in the vicinity. They heard the news of the indestructible Divine Palace's destruction and hurried to the scene. When they saw that the indestructible Divine Palace was indeed destroyed and only ruins were left, they all left resentfully. Ji Tianxing used the various formations in the mountain range to monitor their movements. However, he had no intention of making a move, nor did he alarm them. He allowed the Divine King realm experts to come and go as they pleased. Those people didn't notice anything out of the ordinary and didn't know that the mountain range was filled with traps and formations. Until today, Ji Tianxing was finally alarmed. The target he had been waiting for all this time had appeared. Several 100,000 miles to the west of the indestructible Divine Palace, the aura of a God Emperor expert had appeared and was rapidly moving towards the east. This meant that the God Emperor expert had been detected as soon as he entered the range of Ji Tianxing's formations. After sensing the God Emperor's aura, Ji Tianxing stopped meditating and adjusted his breathing. He focused his attention and observed the situation quietly. Although his formations could detect the God Emperor's aura, they couldn't determine his identity. Without knowing if the other party was the God Emperor of the underworld or if there were other God Emperors, Ji Tianxing wouldn't act rashly. Soon, the formation detected a second God Emperor's aura. This God Emperor's aura also flashed by, moving from west to east, heading straight for the ruins of the indestructible Divine Palace. 2. Ji Tianxing silently observed this thought flashing through his mind. 100 breaths later, a third God Emperor's aura appeared, also passing by the same formation. Not only that great formation but another great formation nearby also sensed it. 3. Ji Tianxing counted in his heart. He bided his time and continued to wait, wondering if a fourth God Emperor would appear. Judging from the current situation, 3 hall masters of the Pantheon of Immortality had returned. If it was only the 3 temple masters and one of them was the god of the underworld, then he still had a chance to take revenge. Unknowingly, an hour had passed. After the 3 hall masters returned to the ruins of the indestructible deity palace, they stopped near the ruins. Ji Tianxing couldn't get close to the ruins and use his divine sense to investigate what they were doing. He could only use the formation near the ruins to detect the 3 God Emperors' whereabouts and guess their movements. Of course, he didn't need to look to know that the 3 God Emperors must be cursing and swearing at the ruins of the immortal shrine. When the 3 God Emperors calm down, only then will they discuss how to repair and rebuild the indestructible deity palace. Ji Tianxing could predict the other party's next move, but he couldn't be sure how many temple masters would return. He had to weigh the pros and cons. If he started to act now to see if the god of the underworld was among the 3 God Emperors, then he would have a high chance of exposing himself. If the god of the underworld was here, then it would be fine. But if the god of the underworld wasn't here, then he would be exposed ahead of time and the plan would fail. Furthermore, even if the god of the underworld was among the 3, he still had to kill him as soon as possible. If a 4th temple master came back while he and the god of the underworld were fighting, then his situation would be very dangerous and his revenge would be hopeless. But he couldn't delay and wait forever. If there were 1 or 2 temple masters on the way back, then it would take half a day or a day for them to arrive. Then this period of time would be his best chance. If he missed it, he might not have another chance. Because of this, Ji Tianxing had to weigh the pros and cons of whether and when he could act today. In the end, he made up his mind and decided to wait for 2 hours. At most, after 2 hours, if there were still 3 God Emperors in the ruins of the indestructible deity palace, then he would act. 2 hours wasn't a long time, it would pass very quickly. Ji Tianxing patiently waited. The 3 temple masters circled around the ruins of the indestructible deity palace a few times to check the situation. Just as Ji Tianxing had expected in the beginning, they were all mad with anger. They kept cursing Ji Tianxing and flew into a rage. When the immortal God Emperor and the others saw that the 3 mountain peaks had been destroyed, all the palaces and residences had been reduced to rubble, and even the underground treasury had been plundered, they felt like their lungs were about to explode. After half an hour of calming down, they finally calmed down. After that, they carefully observed the extent of the damage to the indestructible deity palace and discussed how to rebuild it, estimating the difficulty, time, and resources needed. Each of the 3 god emperors' divine ships carried over 1,000 elite divine kings. If they wanted to rebuild the indestructible deity palace, the 3 of them and the 3,000 elite divine kings could do it. However, that would take a lot of time. The immortal god emperor still decided to send out a decree to gather all the craftsmen and experts in the surrounding temples, gathering at least 10,000 people before starting the operation. That way, the reconstruction of the indestructible deity palace could be completed within a month. The 3 god emperors continued to discuss and supplement the specifics of the operation. 2 hours passed. Just as Zhou Xian was about to take action, he sensed another strand of god emperor's aura. This presence also came from the west, heading straight for the indestructible deity palace. As expected, the 4th temple master has appeared. This thought flashed through Zhou Xian's mind, causing him to frown. He only needed a breath's worth of time to make a decision. I can't wait any longer, I need to act as soon as possible. Furthermore, the method of action can also be changed. He didn't need to check the vicinity of the indestructible deity palace to find out who the 3 god emperors were. He silently flew towards the west, approaching the 4th god emperor who was hurrying back. It wouldn't be too late to make a decision after figuring out the identity of the god emperor. Zhou Xian shuttled through the depths of the ground and soon arrived at the path that the 4th god monarch had to pass through. He hid himself deep underground. A few breaths later, the 4th god emperor arrived as fast as lightning, about to pass by Zhou Xian. Zhou Xian silently released his divine sense to check the appearance and presence of the god emperor. When the god emperor was only 100,000 miles away from him, he finally saw him clearly and was stunned. He didn't expect the heavens to be so kind to him, making him feel so lucky that it was a bit unreal. Because the 4th god emperor who rushed back was wearing a black robe and a cloak, the eerie god of the underworld. Chapter 4768. Zhou Xian was wondering if the god of the underworld was one of the 3 god emperors near the indestructible shrine. After waiting for 2 hours, he decided to approach the ruins of the indestructible shrine and personally investigate the identities of the 3 god emperors. He didn't expect that the god of the underworld would rush back at this time, and he would even encounter him on the way. This was simply like wearing out iron shoes in a fruitless search, only to find it by chance without any effort. In Zhou Xian's mind, a thought immediately emerged, and it was very firm. That was, to act decisively and kill the god of the underworld. Although it was almost impossible for him to kill the god of the underworld in a single move, he would inevitably have to fight with him and cause a huge commotion. But this place was still 400,000 miles away from the ruins of the indestructible shrine, and was at the edge of the god emperor's divine senses detection. If the indestructible god emperor was among the 3 god emperors' divine sense, then there was a certain chance that he would sense the fluctuations of divine power and detect the battle. Other than the indestructible god emperor, the other temple masters were all mid-level god emperor, so they wouldn't be able to detect anything unusual. If the 3 god emperors didn't sense anything unusual and didn't immediately rush over to help, then Zhou Xian would have a certain amount of time to deal with the god of the underworld. This time depended on when the god of the underworld would send out a distress signal, and how long it would take for the 3 god emperors to arrive after receiving the signal. In just a short breath, Zhou Xian's mind flashed through these thoughts, and he considered all the factors clearly. Thus, he decisively took out the sword of burial of heaven, erupted with all his power, and attacked the god of the underworld who was flying high in the sky. Heaven-piercing sword. Zhou Xian was hiding in a mountain peak. The god of the underworld passed by above his head and was in the vast sea of clouds. Zhou Xian unleashed his full power with this strike, and a giant golden sword that was thousands of feet long shot up from the mountain peak into the sky, viciously stabbing towards the god of the underworld. The dazzling divine light illuminated everything within a radius of 30,000 miles. The incomparably violent sword energy pierced through the mountain peak and tore the sky apart. It locked onto the god of the underworld, causing the pressure on him to multiply and his speed to plummet. At this moment, it seemed that only the giant golden sword and the god of the underworld were left in the world. Before returning to the imperishable shrine, The god of the underworld had already considered the possibility that this was Kenshin's scheme to lure him out so that they could find an opportunity to assassinate him. Therefore he was extremely cautious along the way, afraid that he would fall into Kenshin's ambush. Soon he was back at the imperishable shrine. Another 400,000 miles away, and in 20 breaths' time, he would be able to see the imperishable God Emperor and the two temple masters. This was already a very safe area. He believed that Kenshin would not stay here, let alone assassinate him. Therefore the god of the underworld relaxed and let down his guard. This caused him to not be able to detect the danger ahead of time and discover Ji Tianxing's existence. As a result, when the dazzling giant golden sword came at him, he did not even have the chance to dodge or escape. The peerlessly violent sword intent was practically tearing his body to shreds. The terrifying suppressive force made him feel as if he was in a quagmire, unable to move an inch, and his speed had also decreased by more than half. At this critical moment, the only thing he could do was to use all of his divine power to form a shield to block the giant golden sword. At the same time he took out his natal relic and placed it in front of his chest and face to protect the most vital parts of his body. Kaboom! In the next moment, the giant golden sword that was thousands of feet long slammed into the god of the underworld, causing a deafening explosion. Amidst the loud explosion, golden light flashed and fragments flew everywhere. The violent impact rippled outwards. The god of the underworld was also sent flying by the violent impact. He tumbled backwards and crashed into a nearby mountain peak. His divine power shield was shattered, and it exploded into millions of divine light fragments. The natal relic in front of him was also sent flying by the sword light. It flew a circle in the sky before returning to his side. The god of the underworld was severely injured. A huge wound was torn open on his chest by the sword light and blood gushed out. His face was as pale as paper and his entire body was trembling. After tumbling for more than 1,000 miles, he finally dissolved the impact and stopped in the sky. When he saw the appearance of the person who attacked, he was stunned on the spot. He was a little dumbfounded. Kenshin? It's you. The god of the underworld couldn't be more familiar with Kenshin's appearance and divine sense. He only needed a glance to recognize Ji Tianxing's identity. He was shocked and in disbelief. He never expected that Kenshin would appear here. He was caught off guard and dealt him a fatal blow when he let his guard down. Even if the sword didn't kill him and only severely injured him, his strength would still be greatly reduced. He never expected that Kenshin's strength would grow to such a level. He was so much stronger than him. At this moment of life and death, he didn't have time to think too much. Ji Tianxing brandished the Heaven Barrier sword and chased after him without a word, launching another attack. The god of the underworld could only retreat towards the immortal shrine. At the same time he took out a communication jade slip to ask for help from the immortal god emperor. He knew that this place was still 400,000 miles away from the immortal shrine. The immortal god emperor might not be able to detect the abnormality here. For safety's sake he still sent a message to the immortal god emperor so that he could call for reinforcements faster. Moreover, the god of the underworld wanted to save time, so the content of the message was very simple. Lord Hallmaster, for 100,000 miles to the west, I've been ambushed by Kenshin. Please help. It was only a dozen words. He only needed to clearly state the situation and location. There was no superfluous words. Whoosh. The communication jade slip flew out and turned into a ray of light, quickly disappearing into the horizon. The immortal god emperor would definitely be able to receive the SOS, and he would definitely rush over to help in a very short period of time. The god of the underworld heaved a sigh of relief and calmed down a lot. However, Ji Tianxing once again appeared in front of him with his sword, thrusting out 3 dazzling golden sword lights. Each strike was dazzling and locked onto his aura, making it impossible for him to escape. Moreover, the sword intent was unparalleled and sharp, capable of destroying anything in the world. The god of the underworld's shock and fear exploded in his heart, almost taking over his entire mind. Although he was covered in a black robe, his face was covered in a cloak, and the pitch-black aura of death enveloped his entire body. No one could see his expression and no one could see his fear and panic. However, his heart was trembling. Facing those 3 fatal sword lights, he felt a deep sense of helplessness. He could only muster up his courage and release the last of his strength to form a defensive shield and use his natal divine artifact to block in front of him. That's right. Even though he was already mentally prepared for Ji Tianqing's second attack, he still couldn't counterattack and could only continue to block. Bang bang bang. In the next moment, the three dazzling golden sword lights struck the god of the underworld, causing a series of dull explosions. Chapter 4769. This time the god of the underworld's injuries worsened. Even though he dodged one of the swords, he was still hit by the other two. His left arm was chopped off on the spot. The severed arm mixed with blood flew into the air and scattered across the mountains. The other sword pierced through his abdomen, leaving a bowl-sized bloody hole that was constantly bleeding. After suffering such heavy injuries, the god of the underworld's strength greatly decreased, and his movements also became very slow. However, he didn't suffer any fatal injuries, and even his divine body wasn't destroyed, let alone his godhead. His strength was greatly reduced and his combat strength was greatly weakened, so he couldn't block Ji Tianqing's attacks anymore. Since that was the case, he simply turned around and ran, disregarding everything else as fast as he could run towards the immortal god palace. At the same time, he was praying in his heart, hoping that the immortal god emperor would quickly come to his aid after receiving the news. In fact, this was the wisest choice he could make. The immortal god emperor had indeed just received his distressed jade slip, and after reading it he was furious and was rushing towards the battlefield with the other two temple masters. However, the two places were 400,000 miles apart, so even if the immortal god emperor and the others were fast, it would still take them 20 breaths of time. And these 20 breaths of time were the deadline for Ji Tianqing to kill the god of the underworld. If he still couldn't kill the god of the underworld by then, he would be besieged by the immortal god emperor and the others, and the consequences would be unimaginable. In order to end the battle quickly, stop the god of the underworld and kill him, Ji Tianqing didn't care about anything else. As he chased after the god of the underworld, he didn't forget to open the entrance of the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Tower and summon the Prajna god emperor. Whoosh! Ji Tianqing swung the burial of heaven, using the ultimate move of the Sword of Destruction, and slashed out a giant golden sword that was tens of thousands of feet long, capable of destroying everything. The giant sword locked onto the god of the underworld and slashed down from the sky with terrifying power. A huge crack was torn open in the sky and the space was severed. The god of the underworld was shrouded by an invisible pressure. His speed of escape decreased sharply, and his expression became even more terrified. At this time the Prajna god emperor appeared again. He also wielded a divine sword and attacked the god of the underworld together with Ji Tianqing. The god of the underworld was struggling desperately to break free from the world destroyer sword, but when he saw the Prajna god emperor he was dumbfounded. Xianxia, why are you here? The god of the underworld could still understand why Kenshin had set up an ambush here and ambushed him. Or rather, he should have guessed it long ago. However, the sudden appearance of the Prajna god emperor was something that the god of the underworld would never have expected. A few years ago, the Prajna god emperor had contacted him through a jade slip, saying that after being persecuted by the Kenshin, she had been hiding and wandering outside and was building her own force. The god of the underworld had never doubted it. After all, the Prajna god emperor was one of the 5 murderers of the Kenshin. In his opinion, Kenshin would never let go of the Prajna god emperor. There was no possibility of reconciliation between the two. However, reality proved that he had underestimated Kenshin and the Prajna god emperor. In the end, he was caught off guard, and the Prajna god emperor gave him a fatal blow at this time. So this is a woman. After recognizing the Prajna god emperor, the god of the underworld was shocked and angry. In the blink of an eye, he figured out the reason behind it. He gnashed his teeth in hatred and almost vomited blood. If time could be turned back to more than 1,000 years ago, he would never have believed in the Prajna god emperor, and he would never have accepted her as his ally. Unfortunately, it was all too late. Kaboom! In the next moment, the Armageddon sword that could split heaven and earth struck the god of the underworld. There was a deafening sound. Under the terrifying power of the Armageddon sword, the god of the underworld's divine shield was as fragile as paper. It instantly shattered into pieces. The divine artifact that he had summoned back with great difficulty also cracked. Its divine light dimmed and it flew into the distance. Then the god of the underworld was swallowed by the giant golden sword. His body, which was already heavily injured, was chopped into more than 20 pieces on the spot. It was mixed with blood and scattered in the sky. Among the pieces of the body in the sky, there was a 5-colored diamond-shaped crystal. It shone with bright divine light and was particularly eye-catching. That was the divine spark of the god of the underworld. It had also been damaged by the Armageddon sword and cracked, but it was not heavily injured. If this divine spark could escape, the god of the underworld would still be alive and have a chance to rise again. But at this time the Prajna god emperor arrived. Kaboom! She waved her sword and stabbed out with an unparalleled sharp light. It accurately hit the god of the underworld's divine spark. With a dull sound, the god of the underworld's divine spark was sent flying. The surface of the divine spark flashed with divine light as dense cracks appeared on it. With the Prajna god emperor's strength, it was naturally difficult for her to kill the god of the underworld, even if he only had one divine spark left. But the Prajna god emperor's sword had destroyed the god of the underworld's defenses and severely injured his divine spark, causing him to fall into a coma. It was a great achievement. Whoosh! The cracked divine spark was still flying into the distance. Tianxia chased after it with the sword of burial of heaven. In the sky 100,000 miles away, a dazzling divine light sped over like a meteor. It was the undying god emperor who had rushed over to help. His heart burned with anxiety as he flew at full speed. Even from 100,000 miles away, he used his divine sense to see the situation clearly. He discovered the Prajna god emperor and Tianxia, as well as the god of the underworld whose divine spark had been damaged. Thief, how dare you! Seeing that Tianxia had caught up to the god of the underworld's divine spark and was about to attack again, the undying god emperor roared in anger. Unfortunately, he was still 100,000 miles away from the god of the underworld's divine spark, while Tianxia was only 10,000 miles away. No matter how fast he was, he could not stop Tianxia from killing the god of the underworld. At this time, Tianxia was faced with a dilemma. On one side was the god of the underworld who could be killed in 2 breaths of time. Even further away was the undying god emperor and the 2 god emperor middle-level temple masters who had rushed over to help. If he insisted on killing the god of the underworld, he would inevitably be entangled by the undying god emperor and the others. If he did not want to be in danger, he would have to give up on killing the god of the underworld and turn around to flee. Not only did Tianxia understand this, but the Prajna god emperor also guessed this outcome. She was worried for him and wanted to know what choice he would make. But with the Prajna god emperor's understanding of Tianxia, she guessed that Tianxia would not give up. Just as expected, Tianxia ignored the undying god emperor and the 2 temple masters who were rushing over and insisted on swinging his sword at the god of the underworld. Sword cleaves the 9 heavens. When he was still several thousand miles away from the god of the underworld's divine spark, he swung his sword with all his strength and unleashed a dazzling golden greatsword. Kaboom! The golden greatsword viciously struck the god of the underworld's divine spark, causing a dull explosion that reverberated through the world. The divine spark immediately shattered into a dozen fragments that scattered through the air. Chapter 4770. In the end, the god of the underworld could not escape death, slain by Tianxia's sword. At this point, the 5 god emperors who had joined forces to kill him, except for the Prajna god emperor, had all been killed by him. He had taken his revenge and settled his grudges. The hatred that had been suppressed in Tianxia's heart for many years was finally released and dissipated. The Prajna god emperor had also used his actions to prove that ever since he had formed an alliance with him, he had no other intentions. Even in the face of his former allies, the Prajna god emperor would unwaveringly help him. Thus, the few remaining grudges between the 2 had also drifted away. Even the grudges and wariness in the depths of their hearts would gradually fade with the passage of time. Although the price of doing so was somewhat heavy. The undying god emperor had already rushed to the battlefield, and the 2 temple lords were close behind. The 3 of them had locked onto Tianxia. There was no need to guess what was going to happen next. But Tianxia had no regrets. Even if he could go back in time, he would still make the same choice. After settling the grudges of his previous life, Tianxia no longer had any worries or obsessions. If he could escape the pursuit of the undying god emperor and the others today, he would consider how to survive in the continent of origin and pursue the mysteries of immortality. Kenshin, you dog thief, you dared to destroy my divine palace and kill my temple lord. Die. The undying God Emperor had finally arrived, and when he was still 20,000 li away from Ji Tianxing, he roared and slashed out with his sword, filling the sky with sword light. Swish swish swish. The sword light sprinkled down, enveloping Ji Tianxing's figure and sealing off the surrounding 10,000 li of space. The terrifying sword intent fiercely suppressed Ji Tianxing, leaving him with nowhere to run. Ji Tianxing's sword cultivation could be said to be unparalleled in the world, and no one could compare. Even the undying God Emperor could not compare to him. But the undying God Emperor's strength far surpassed his by several levels, and his fighting strength was even greater. At this moment Ji Tianxing felt the threat and aura of death. The Prajna God Emperor was also within the range of the sword radiance. The pressure was immense and he could hardly protect himself. At the critical moment, neither of them hesitated or retreated. They could only unleash their full strength and cast their secret techniques to form a shield and neutralize the power of the sword light. Limitless chaos. Ji Tianxing shouted in a low voice. Golden light gushed out from his body and condensed into an oval-shaped shield to protect him. Countless sword lights slashed at him, producing a series of muffled bangs that lingered in his ears. The sword lights collapsed one after another, turning into divine light fragments that filled the sky and dissipating into the heavens and the earth. This was one of Ji Tianxing's strongest defensive divine abilities. The power of the shield was indescribable. Unfortunately, the shield was only able to withstand a few thousand sword rays before it crumbled and fell apart. Dozens of dazzling sword rays also hit Ji Tianxing, but they were also blocked by the divine armor and shattered by the sword of burial of heaven. After the sword lights dissipated, Ji Tianxing only suffered some light injuries. He looked a little disheveled and was in a sorry state, but there were no major problems. However, the Prajna God Emperor's injuries were more serious. Not only was his clothes in tatters, but he was also covered in blood with at least 20 wounds. Fortunately, she was at the edge of the sword lights. If the undying God Emperor had targeted her, she would have lost half her life even if she didn't die. Seeing the Prajna God Emperor's injuries so serious, Ji Tianxing didn't hesitate and hurriedly put her into the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Pagoda, allowing her to return to the distorted spacetime to heal. At this time the other two temple lords also arrived at the battlefield. They joined forces with the undying God Emperor and formed a battle formation to surround Ji Tianxing. The two temple lords were also unable to restrain their anger and roared with murderous intent. Kenshin, you damned bastard, it was you who destroyed our divine palace and killed our clansmen. Today we will make you pay with your blood. Hand over your life. After roaring, the two temple lords exploded with all their strength, waving their divine weapons and taking the lead in attacking. In the past, their hatred and killing intent towards Kenshin came from the god of the underworld's embellishment and adding fuel to the fire. However, ever since Kenshin destroyed the immortal palace and slaughtered thousands of desolate race guards and servants, the few temple lords developed a true hatred for him. Swish, swish, swish. More than 1,000 sword beams intertwined into a sword net and smashed towards Ji Tianxing, tearing the sky apart. The undying God Emperor didn't stay idle either. His left hand formed a divine seal and conjured a majestic divine power, striking out a fist beam the size of a mountain at Ji Tianxing. He waved his divine sword in his right hand and stabbed out more than 20 sword beams, locking onto Ji Tianxing's vital points. The combined attack of the three temple lords was too powerful and the attacks were too concentrated. Ji Tianxing was unable to dodge. No matter how strong his defense was, it was impossible for him to block it head-on. He would only suffer more serious injuries. Under such circumstances he had no choice but to use his ultimate skill. Heaven and Earth Incarnation. This divine power was also born out of the celestial chaos mystic technique. However, it didn't condense a divine power shield, but merged with the heaven and earth for hundreds of thousands of miles. Swish. Seeing the sky full of sword beams descending and the mountain-sized fist shadow smashing towards Ji Tianxing, his body flashed with a white light and he instantly disappeared. He had merged with the heaven and earth in a radius of more than 300,000 miles. The three temple lords could sense his presence but they couldn't see his body. Naturally, the sword light that filled the sky and the fist shadows that were as big as mountains also missed their target. They fiercely smashed into the empty space between the towering mountain range and the peaks. Rumble. A deafening sound exploded and reverberated between heaven and earth, spreading out for hundreds of thousands of miles. At least 30 mountains, 9 mountain ranges, and 6 canyons were reduced to ruins under the bombardment of the sword beams and fist shadows. Everything within a radius of 20,000 miles was destroyed, leaving behind only desolated ruins and flying dust. Cracks appeared on the ground, forming a wide ravine and gap that extended in all directions. Before the smoke and dust dissipated, the immortal God Emperor and the 2 temple lords realized that something was wrong. Their expressions changed and they all frowned. They released their divine senses to search for Ji Tianqing's figure. Unfortunately, they couldn't find any trace of Ji Tianqing even after searching a radius of 200,000 miles. The 3 of them were a little confused and couldn't figure out what the problem was. Strange, how did that guy disappear in a flash? Did he use some teleportation divine power to escape our encirclement? No matter what kind of teleportation divine power he used, it's impossible to teleport 200,000 miles away. He didn't escape 200,000 miles away. He's still in our vicinity and we can still detect his presence. He's everywhere. This is even more puzzling. His presence is right next to us, but he's nowhere to be found. Why can't we find him? The 3 temple lords looked at each other and discussed with their divine senses, trying to come up with a solution. Unfortunately, they were unable to figure out how Ji Tianqing had disappeared. Naturally, they were unable to find a way to solve the problem. At this moment, Ji Tianqing's presence that filled the world suddenly dissipated. He borrowed the power of heaven and earth to appear in a mountain range 300,000 miles away, using this method to complete a long-distance teleportation. Chapter 4771. Swoosh. With a flash of white light, Ji Tianqing appeared at the peak of a mountain. He didn't need to look back to know that the immortal God Emperor and the 2 hall masters were still in a daze. There wasn't much time left for him and he didn't have the time to say any harsh words. Escaping was the best choice. He turned into a meteor and streaked across the sky, fleeing north as fast as he could. That's right, the only place he could escape to now was the north. The immortal God Emperor and the 2 hall masters were in the east. If he went west, he might encounter other hall masters or the experts of the Taiyu Shrine. If he went south, he would have to pass through half of the Pantheon of Immortality's territory, enter the unknown land and return to the area ruled by the 9 Yang God Emperor. Only by escaping north could he reach the Chaos Sea. Ji Tianqing had been on the planet of origin for almost 20 years. However, in these 20 years he had no time to develop his forces, nor did he have any backers or helpers. The beasts in the unknown land in the far west were willing to help him, but unfortunately they were too far away. Other than that, only the 2 sea beast overlords in the Chaos Sea, those 2 ancient creatures, could help him. Swoosh. The meteor streaked across the sky and quickly disappeared. At this time, the immortal God Emperor also led the 2 hall masters and chased north without caring about their own safety. Although Ji Tianqing used his ultimate skill of transforming into heaven and earth to teleport 300,000 miles away. However, the immortal God Emperor and the 2 hall masters' divine senses were more than 300,000 miles away. When they expanded their divine senses to the limit and explored a radius of more than 300,000 miles, they naturally discovered Ji Tianqing. Even if they couldn't understand what method Ji Tianqing used to teleport 300,000 miles away. However, now was not the time to think about these questions. They could only chase after him as fast as they could. The 2 sides started a chase high in the sky. The 2 hall masters' flying speed was about the same as Ji Tianqing's. They couldn't pull away in a short period of time. However, the immortal God Emperor was stronger, and his speed was slightly faster than Ji Tianqing's. As time passed, the distance between him and Ji Tianqing was slowly closing. Ji Tianqing didn't hesitate either. In order to get rid of them as soon as possible, he decisively performed the so close yet so far skill. Swish. With a flash of white light, he disappeared from the sky. In the next instant he appeared 150,000 miles away. The distance between him and the undying God Emperor immediately increased to 420,000 kilometers. Even though the immortal God Emperor's divine sense was very powerful, this distance was the limit of what he could detect. He could only vaguely sense Ji Tianqing's aura. Damn it! That guy just teleported 300,000 miles. How long has it been? How did he teleport another 100,000 miles? The immortal God Emperor was both furious and shocked, unable to accept this fact. He couldn't understand. With his strength, how could he have such a method? In the past, he still believed in the god of the underworld's words. He thought that Kenshin was here for revenge and had nothing to do with the Chosen One. But now he began to doubt the god of the underworld's words and re-evaluated Kenshin. As an upper god emperor, he had condensed 7 Taoist rhymes and was very strong. However, he couldn't teleport twice in a quarter of an hour like Ji Tianxing. He couldn't help but think that there was something wrong with Kenshin. No matter what, he couldn't let him escape. He had to capture him. Thus, he didn't hesitate to use his teleportation ability and speed up his chase. Swish. Another flash of white light appeared in the sky. The immortal god emperor's figure also disappeared. In the next instant, he also traversed 180,000 kilometers of space and appeared in another sky. The distance between him and Ji Tianxing shrunk to 200,000 miles. His divine sense was still covering the other party. The other 2 temple lords were a bit anxious after being shaken off. They hurriedly used their teleportation ability to give chase. It was a pity that their teleportation divine ability could only teleport them for about 100,000 miles. The effect was not great. No matter what, they couldn't give up. They had to follow the immortal god emperor and kill Kenshin. Another quarter of an hour passed. The distance between the immortal god emperor and Ji Tianxing had shrunk to around 200,000 miles. At this time, Ji Tianxing had already calmed down his divine power and aura. He used the "so close yet worlds apart" ability again. With another flash of white light, he crossed another 150,000 miles and pulled away from the immortal god emperor. The immortal god emperor was even more depressed. His divine sense locked onto Ji Tianxing 350,000 miles away. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind. First of all, he couldn't use teleportation anymore. It would take him at least an hour to do so. But Kenshin did it. He could teleport every quarter of an hour. What kind of concept was that? As far as he knew, none of the 20 or so god emperor powerhouses of the 4 temples could do it. This made the immortal god emperor even more certain that the god emperor of the underworld was lying. Kenshin was different from the other god emperors. He was extremely talented and had many tricks up his sleeve. He was definitely not an ordinary god emperor. If the Chosen One had appeared long ago, then it had to be Kenshin. Apart from this guy, there was no one else who fit the criteria of being the Chosen One. With this in mind, the immortal god emperor hurriedly took out a transmission jade slip and sent a message to the other 2 temple lords. He had them rush to the northern region and join forces to intercept Kenshin. The 2 temple lords had stayed behind to guard the western region. They had been surrounded by several temple lords of the Taiyu Shrine and had almost lost their lives. They had paid the price of heavy injuries and even sacrificed the headquarters of one of their temples to escape by a fluke. The 2 temple lords had hidden themselves somewhere safe and were currently in seclusion to heal their wounds. When they suddenly received the immortal god emperor's transmission jade slip, they found out that the god emperor of the underworld had been killed. Kenshin was fleeing and the first temple lord and the others were pursuing him. The 2 temple lords were shocked and incredulous. They hadn't expected Kenshin to be so sinister and cunning. He could avoid the first temple lord and the others and kill the god emperor of the underworld on his own. With their current heavily injured state, even if they ran into Kenshin, they might not necessarily be his match. They might even be killed. Logically speaking, they didn't want to stop and kill Kenshin. But the immortal god emperor had given the order and they could only obey. They reluctantly ended their recuperation and drove the divine worship north. In addition to summoning the 2 temple lords who had stayed behind to guard the western region, the immortal god emperor also ordered the experts of the various temples in the northern region to be summoned. He had the temple lords of the various temples personally lead a group of elite god kings and quickly gather at a designated location. They formed an inescapable net to surround and capture Kenshin. Just like that, the Pantheon of Immortality's main target changed from the Taiyu Shrine to Kenshin. They also mobilized their strongest forces. Although Ji Tianxing had successfully shaken off the immortal god emperor and the pursuit of the 3 temple lords a day later, he didn't dare to stop. Even though he had exhausted a great deal of his divine power and was weakened, he still had to board the Godslayer warship and continue fleeing north. The immortal god emperor had lost track of Ji Tianxing and his aura, but he didn't give up on the pursuit and continued north. Chapter 4772. A storm was brewing in the pantheon of immortality's territory. Paper couldn't contain fire. News of the destruction of the Palace of Immortality and the death of the god of the underworld spread to the various temples. This was especially true for the 20 or so temples in the north. Their hallmasters summoned 2,000 elite god kings and hurried to certain regions, as if a great battle was imminent. This caused the citizens of the branch halls to be filled with fear and worry. Almost 99% of them didn't know the inside story. They only knew that the Palace of Immortality had been destroyed and a hallmaster killed. This was an earth-shattering event. Almost everyone subconsciously believed that the culprit behind all this was the Cosmos Temple. In their eyes, only the neighboring Taiyu Shrine had the strength and means to do so. As a matter of fact, the Cosmos Sacred Hall was the main reason why the situation had developed to this point. If not for the Taiyu Shrine keeping the Pantheon of Immortality in check, things wouldn't have turned out this way. Just as the Pantheon of Immortality was mobilizing all of its forces to hunt down Ji Tianxing, the Taiyu Shrine's hallmasters were about to arrive at the Palace of Immortality. They could have gone straight to the Palace of Immortality to find the immortal god Emperor and Kenshin, then find a way to capture the Kenshin. However, the Taiyu god Emperor had always been cautious and wouldn't act rashly. Before arriving at the Palace of Immortality, he sent the hallmasters to gather information. In the end, all three of them received important information. Only then did they learn that the immortal god Emperor and the god of the underworld had already returned to the Palace of Immortality. However, the god of the underworld was unlucky enough to be hunted down by a mysterious expert. Now, the immortal god Emperor and the other hallmasters were chasing after the mysterious expert with all their might towards the north. Such an important piece of news shook God Emperor Taiyu to the core. He even felt excited. The fact that Kenshin was able to accurately intercept and kill the god of the underworld was a testament to his strength and skill. The stronger Kenshin was, the more it proved that Taiyu God Emperor's judgment was correct. That guy was the chosen one. This made Taiyu God Emperor and the others even more determined to capture Kenshin. Thus, God Emperor Taiyu decisively ordered the warships to turn around and chase north at top speed. The temple lords were confused and asked Taiyu God Emperor what was going on. Taiyu God Emperor explained the situation to them. The temple lords were excited and eager to give it a try. One of the hallmasters had some misgivings and could not help but ask, "Great Hallmaster, the Netherworld Divine Emperor has just joined the Immortal Shrine and it seems like it hasn't been long. Even if Kenshin destroyed the Palace of Immortality, the God Emperor Taiyu wouldn't have such a big reaction and come out in full force to hunt him down, right? Do you think the god of the underworld might have noticed Kenshin's extraordinariness and believed him to be the chosen one?" Taiyu God Emperor nodded. The God Emperor Taiyu is no fool. How could he not know this? Otherwise, he wouldn't have mobilized so many people and asked all the branches in the north to gather manpower. Actually, it doesn't matter if he guesses that Kenshin is the chosen one. That's not what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is whether Kenshin can escape his pursuit. The second temple lord frowned in thought. What if the god Emperor Taiyu catches up to Kenshin and they fight? What if the god Emperor Taiyu kills Kenshin in a fit of rage? The other palace masters nodded their heads, revealing the same worry. Taiyu God Emperor Taiyu raised an eyebrow, a playful smile on his lips. "I'm worried about this as well, but given the god Emperor Taiyu's style, he shouldn't be that reckless. As for Kenshin, if he really is the chosen one, he must have the means, strength and opportunity to escape death. Alright, don't think too much about it. Just rest up and prepare for battle." Since the head palace master was so confident and full of confidence in the sword god, the other palace masters dispelled their worries. The God Slayer battleship sped north. In order to reach maximum speed, it didn't activate any concealment or aura concealment formations. Bai Long focused on steering the ship, vigilantly observing the surroundings. He didn't dare relax. He knew that his master's revenge had been avenged and his wish fulfilled. Now all he needed to do was escape the pursuit of the Pantheon of Immortality and escape into the Chaos Sea. Then he would be able to fly freely in the vast sky and swim freely in the vast sea. This was the most critical moment. No accidents could happen. Ji Tianxing wasn't in the cockpit of the ship. He was in the distorted spacetime of the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Pagoda, silently cultivating and recovering his divine power. Even though he had temporarily shaken off the pursuit of the god Emperor Taiyu, He knew that the God Emperor Tai Yu wouldn't let him go. However, he knew that the immortal God Emperor would not give up so easily. He was still in danger. He had to recover his divine power as soon as possible so that he could face the next encirclement. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. 5 days had passed in the outside world. The God Slayer battleship had also crossed the territory of 2 branches and was about to enter the 3rd branch. The journey was rather peaceful. Although some godly king realm guards and patrols had discovered traces of the God Slayer battleship, those godly king realm guards and patrols weren't strong enough. They couldn't catch up to the God Slayer battleship. Even if they released their mystical abilities, they couldn't hurt the God Slayer battleship at all. Until the morning of the 6th day. The God Slayer battleship had just entered the territory of a branch and was flying above a green grassland. At this moment, divine light lit up on the left. It was like a 5-colored cloud that flew over. Bai Long immediately perked up and became much more vigilant. Even though it was still a little far away, he couldn't see who was in the cloud. However, at this time almost all unknown people were enemies. Therefore Bai Long didn't hesitate. He directly controlled the God Slayer battleship and accelerated to the right. The target of the 5-colored cloud was also very obvious. When it saw the God Slayer battleship speeding up, it actually accelerated and chased after it as if it wanted to stop the God Slayer battleship. Both of them were flying diagonally, and the distance between them was constantly shrinking. Unless the God Slayer battleship's speed doubled, they would soon meet and cross paths. Bai Long couldn't possibly turn around and fly back just to avoid the cloud. Therefore he could only activate the battleship's defensive barrier and activate the divine cannons ready to fire. The 360 cannons were all accumulating terrifying power. They flickered with dazzling divine light. Bai Long also hoped that with the deterrence of these divine cannons, the people in the 5-colored cloud would know the difficulty and retreat. Unfortunately, the few hundred godly king realm experts in the 5-colored cloud clearly knew what kind of mission they were carrying and what kind of terrifying experts they were about to face. Even though the aura emitted by the divine cannons made them feel terrified and fearful, they didn't retreat at all. 10 breaths later, the 5-colored cloud and the God Slayer battleship were finally about to meet. The distance between the two was only about 20,000 kilometers. At this moment Bai Long activated the array and decisively opened fire. Chapter 4773. Boom, boom, boom. A deafening sound rang out, reverberating endlessly between heaven and earth. The 360 cannons on the God-slaying battleship spewed out blinding divine light, releasing destructive power. More than 300 colorful divine power light pillars locked onto the God-slaying battleship, covering the entire sky and the clouds. In fact, the few hundred godly kings in the 5-colored clouds were also in the battleship. The owner of the battleship was the hall master of this branch. He was a peak godly king. The battleship was also a top-grade king-class battleship. Furthermore, it had been reinforced and strengthened. Its power far exceeded other battleships of the same grade. The divine light emitted from the battleship condensed into a 5-colored cloud, which was also used to conceal and prevent other people from probing. As it approached the God-slaying battleship, the battleship also activated its divine cannons. When the God-slaying battleship opened fire, the hall master also decisively ordered the cannons to open fire and attack the God-slaying battleship. Similarly, more than 300 colorful divine power light pillars shot towards the God-slaying battleship like a rain of arrows. As such, the two waves of divine power light pillars collided in the sky and began to bombard each other. Boom, boom, boom. The divine power light pillars from both sides exploded at the same time, bursting into divine light fragments that covered the sky and splattered in all directions. However, in comparison, the divine power light pillars released by the king-class battleship had almost completely collapsed. On the other hand, only 40% of the divine power light pillars released by the God-slaying battleship had been shattered. There were still more than 200 light pillars that pierced the 5-colored clouds like sharp arrows. Boom, 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 boom. The explosions reverberated in the sky. The multicolored clouds were blasted into pieces and quickly dissipated. The king-class battleship that was enveloped by the 5-colored clouds could not withstand the terrifying impact and was sent flying. Dozens of dents appeared on the battleship's surface. There were also a few wide cracks that flickered with divine light. The battleship had suffered such heavy damage, so its power naturally decreased greatly. However, the Hall Master managed to control the rolling battleship in time. After flying for more than 100 miles, the battleship came to a stop in the sky. In order to do this, the Hall Master had paid a certain price. He had expended a large amount of divine power. Without any hesitation, he hurriedly opened the cabin door of the battleship and let out an angry roar. Kill! We have to hold them back no matter what. Within the battleship, the hundreds of god kings who had been waiting for a long time also surged out of the battleship with sabers in hand. The Kenshin soldiers surged out like a tide. They brandished their weapons and charged towards the god-slaying battleship while shouting crazily. It was a pity that the God-Slayer battleship could not teleport on the planet of origin, let alone jump through space. Even if the battleship sped up, it could not compare to the hundreds of god kings who could teleport. Swish. Swish. One after another, elite god kings used teleportation and appeared around the god-slaying battleship. In a blink of an eye, 600 elite divine kings formed an encirclement, surrounding the god-slaying battleship tightly. In order to restrain the god-slaying battleship, the 600 elite god kings worked together to form a battle formation. They unleashed various divine abilities and supreme skills to surround and attack the god-slaying battleship. Thousands of rays of divine light, sword light, wind, fire, and lightning that blotted out the sky poured down like a torrential flood, bombarding the god-slaying battleship. The White Dragon did not panic in the face of danger. He manipulated the formation of the warship to strengthen the defensive shield and increase its power by 30%. Bang! 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 In the next instant, the sky full of divine light bombarded the god-slaying battleship, slamming heavily into the defensive shield. The loud, muffled sounds traveled far and could be heard from tens of thousands of miles away. The dark golden shield that enveloped the god-slaying battleship shook violently from the bombardment. It was even distorted. However, the defensive shield withstood all the attacks and did not shatter. It was still intact, but its light dimmed slightly. The White Dragon manipulated the formation and continued to replenish the defensive shield's energy. At the same time, he activated the divine cannon and fired at the elite god kings. Although the divine cannon released more than 300 beams of divine light, it was unable to cover the entire area around the battleship. However, the hundreds of elite god kings on the left and right sides of the battleship were all covered by the firepower. Boom, boom, boom. More than 300 beams of divine light locked onto the many elite god kings and bombarded them with deafening explosions. Those god king experts could not dodge or neutralize the attacks. They could only use their own strength to block them. As a result, the defensive barriers of the vast majority of god kings were shattered, and they were also sent flying. Most of them were heavily injured and their bodies were covered in blood. Countless fragments of divine light mixed with fresh blood rained down from the sky. It was truly a bloodbath. However, even though these elite god kings had suffered such heavy injuries and setbacks, they were still unwilling to retreat. They continued to attack bravely. Clearly, when they were carrying out their mission, the branch hall master had given them a death order. Even if they had to sacrifice all of their lives, it would be a great contribution if they could hold back the god-slaying battleship. If they succeeded, all those who participated would receive the honor of being conferred by the temple, as well as extremely generous compensation and compensation. As the saying went, generous rewards would attract brave men. Furthermore, these elite god kings of the desolate race were hot-blooded and full of pride. At this moment they were truly fearless. They no longer cared about life and death. Ping, ping, ping. Regardless of whether they were injured or not, the elite god kings released their mystic arts at all costs and began attacking again. Divine technique shadows that blotted out the sky engulfed the god-slaying battleship once again. There were deafening booms and billions of divine light fragments. The god-slaying battleship's defensive shield trembled violently once again. Its light dimmed even more. If this carried on, the defensive shield would shatter after 2 or 3 more attacks. At the same time, the divine cannon needed some time to activate. The branch hall master was not an idiot. In just a few seconds he had identified the god-slaying battleship's strengths and weaknesses. Hence, he decisively commanded the few hundred elite god kings to expand the encirclement and maintain a distance from the god-slaying battleship. Furthermore, Everyone had to move around and engage in battle with the god-slaying battleship. They could not stay in the sky and assume a formation to be a live target. This move was indeed effective. Nearly 600 elite god kings expanded the encirclement and engaged in battle with the god-slaying battleship. They became extremely agile and coordinated well with each other. Even though White Dragon had adjusted his strategy and launched another 3 attacks with the divine cannon, he did not achieve much. He only managed to kill a few dozen god kings. He was anxious and did not wish to engage in battle with the god kings. He made the god-slaying battleship speed up in a bid to break through the encirclement and carve out a bloody path. Unexpectedly, after the branch hall master saw through his intentions, he led more than 200 fearless elite god kings to stand in front of the god-slaying battleship. They were willing to stop it at all costs. Boom, boom, boom. Both sides clashed. The god-slaying battleship shattered the divine technique beams and blocked most of the divine ability attacks. There were even more than 20 god kings who were smashed to smithereens by the god-slaying battleship. However, the god-slaying battleship still failed to break through the encirclement. Chapter 4774. No matter how powerful those few hundred godly kings were, it was impossible for them to destroy the god-slaying battleship. It was no exaggeration to say that White Dragon was invincible in controlling the god-slaying battleship. However, it was very difficult for him to break through the encirclement of the few hundred godly kings. If he continued fighting, he would only waste more time. If this dragged on, even if he could kill those few hundred godly kings, it would be meaningless. By then, the Hall Masters of the Pantheon of Immortality would rush over and surround the god-slaying battleship. They would not be able to escape even if they wanted to. In such a critical situation, White Dragon could only call for his master to resolve it. Swoosh. With a flash of white light, Zhou Xian, who had just finished his seclusion, appeared in the control room of the battleship. Without needing White Dragon to report, he scanned the surroundings with his divine perception. He immediately frowned as a cold light surged out of his eyes. Without any hesitation, Zhou Xian flew out of the god-slaying battleship and appeared in the sky. He was enveloped in a sacred golden light as he held the sword of burial of heaven with both hands. He slashed out dozens of huge golden swords at the crowd in front of the battleship. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. The dozens of huge swords slashed down at the same time, erupting with destructive power that drowned the group of elite godly kings. Sensing the terrifying sword intent and the aura of death, the 100-odd godly kings were filled with fear. They were so frightened that their guts were shattered. They panicked and instinctively tried to escape, but it was too late. There was no way for them to escape. Bam, bam, bam. A deafening sound rang out, reverberating endlessly between heaven and earth. Blood spurted out from the crowd and countless severed limbs flew out. Miserable howls that shook the heavens and the earth resounded. One godly king expert after another was sliced into pieces by the sword light. Countless corpses were scattered everywhere. The godheads were destroyed one after another, shattering into multicolored fragments that fluttered in the air. Violent, devastating winds wrapped in 5-colored divine light exploded in the sky, creating ripples after ripples in the sky. Zhou Xian used this move to instantly kill dozens of elite godly kings, tearing a huge gap in the enemy's encirclement. White Dragon had been controlling the god-slaying battleship, waiting for the opportunity to break through. When he saw a gap in the encirclement, he controlled the deity-slaying battleship and charged over without a care for anything else. Originally, the god-slaying battleship could have used this opportunity to break through the encirclement. However, Zhou Xian and the White Dragon did not expect that and underestimated the determination of the Branch Hall Master. The Branch Hall Master actually did not fear death. He led over 100 elite god kings and formed a human wall in front of the battleship. There was no battle formation. They just relied on the divine light shield in their own bodies to form a sturdy barrier. Even though they knew that they would definitely die if they did so, they still did it without hesitation. Boom. The god-slaying battleship that was enveloped in divine light slammed into the group of god kings with an earth-shaking boom. Divine light burst forth and a loud noise shook the heavens. The several dozen god kings were all blown away. Their bodies were either damaged or broken, or they were covered in wounds and blood. Apart from the 30-odd god kings who were uninjured, the remaining 90-odd god kings were either killed on the spot or heavily injured. Even the branch hall master who was leading them was heavily injured. His hair was disheveled and his body was covered in blood. Although they had paid such a huge sacrifice, their sacrifice was meaningful. In exchange, the god-slaying battleship was blocked once again. This group of god kings stalled for another 10 seconds before rallying and forming another encirclement. They wanted to stop the god-slaying battleship at all costs. Ji Tianxing was enraged. His expression was cold as he struck out with a mountain-sized dragon-elephant fist shadow with his left hand. He waved his sword with his right hand and used a sword Dao technique. Daylight sword. Boom. The mountain-sized dragon-elephant fist shadow struck the 20-odd elite god kings. A loud noise erupted as they were blasted into pieces. Blood and flesh splattered everywhere. A cold light suddenly appeared and bloomed in the crowd. It instantly expanded into a dazzling sun that spanned thousands of miles. The 100 elite god kings blocking the god-slaying battleship were all swallowed by the daylight sword. They melted like snow in the dazzling golden sun. Even their god heads were reduced to dust. The power of this sword technique was too terrifying. None of the elite god kings that were swallowed by the daylight sword survived. Even the branch hall master, who was a peak god king, was killed by the daylight sword. He was reduced to ashes and no longer existed. This time the obstacles in front of the god-slaying battleship were cleared. No one could stop it anymore. The 100-odd elite god kings that were lucky enough to survive were all heavily injured. They no longer had the strength to fight. The branch hall master was already dead. Without a leader, they were like a pile of loose sand. Their morale naturally collapsed. They could only watch helplessly as the god-slaying battleship lit up with a dazzling divine light. It streaked across the sky like a shooting star and flew away. A moment later, the god-slaying battleship disappeared into the horizon. The elite god kings that were lucky enough to survive finally regained their senses. They all looked as if a heavy burden had been lifted off their shoulders. The joy of surviving a calamity made them forget their pain for the time being. But there were also many elite god kings who were extremely dejected. After calming down and thinking about it carefully, they felt that it was not worth it. They had paid such a terrible price, even sacrificing their branch hall master, just to prove that the god-slaying battleship did indeed have someone that the divine hall was pursuing. They had sacrificed so much just to delay the god-slaying battleship for a moment. It was simply impossible to stop it. Was it worth it? At this moment, a divine light lit up the sky in the south. This divine light shot over like a shooting star. In just a few breaths of time, it arrived near the battlefield. Within the dazzling divine light was a majestic god-slaying battleship. The person operating the god-slaying battleship saw the ruins that spanned tens of thousands of miles. He also saw the corpses and debris scattered across the battlefield. He also saw the 100-odd survivors. Swish. The god-slaying battleship hurriedly slowed down and stopped in the sky. The god-slaying battleship's hatch opened. A group of guards escorting a God Emperor expert appeared in the sky. This majestic God Emperor expert was none other than the undying God Emperor. He expressionlessly arrived on the battlefield, looked around, then stared at the surviving God Kings and asked them what had happened. The God Kings were still in a state of shock. When they saw that the newcomer was one of their own and sensed the powerful aura of the undying God Emperor, they all bowed. Afterwards, several of the clever God Kings began to report what had happened to the undying God Emperor. Of course, before reporting, they did not forget to state their identities and origins to the undying God Emperor. They were doing this to claim credit. At the very least, the Temple Master would remember them and reward them according to their contributions in the future. When the undying God Emperor heard what had happened, he knew that he was not far from the Kenshin battleship. If he worked a little harder, he would be able to catch up. Naturally, he was in a great mood. After hearing how brutal the battle had been and how these God Kings had sacrificed so much, he immediately promised that the temple would reward them handsomely. Chapter 4775. Originally, the surviving God Kings were in low spirits. Many of them felt that the price they had paid was not worth it. But after hearing the immortal God Emperor's promise, they felt relieved and their mood improved. Everyone bowed and thanked the immortal God Emperor. The immortal God Emperor did not linger. He turned around and returned to the godship, quickly leaving. Following that, the godship rushed north at full speed, hoping to catch up to Kenshin as soon as possible. The immortal god emperor was the fastest. The distance between him and Ji Tianxing had also shrunk to about 1,000,000 miles. The other two temple masters followed behind. They were still 2,000,000 miles away from the immortal god emperor. As for the other temple masters of the Taiyu shrine, they were also chasing with all their might. But the distance was simply too great. They were separated by more than 10,000,000 miles. No matter how one looked at it, the immortal god emperor had a huge advantage. He was also the one with the most hope of catching up to Ji Tianxing. After all, if Ji Tianxing wanted to reach the northern border of the Pantheon of Immortality, he still had to pass through 4 temple halls. The temple masters of the 4 temple halls were leading a group of elite god kings towards the route designated by the immortal god emperor to intercept the god-slayer warship. The white dragon piloted the god-slayer warship and continued to fly north at full speed. Ji Tianxing returned to the distorted spacetime and went into seclusion to cultivate. He was at a critical juncture of his seclusion when he finally found an opportunity to condense Taoist rhymes. If not for the white dragon's interruption, he would have already condensed the embryonic form of the 5th Taoist rhyme. Now that he had to continue his seclusion, he could only start all over again and work hard to condense the 5th Taoist rhyme. However, before he went into closed-door cultivation, Ji Tianxing understood one thing. If he did not control the God-Slayer warship and continued to let the White Dragon pilot it, the immortal God Emperor would soon catch up to them. In fact, the God-Slayer warship would even be intercepted by the God Kings of the other temple halls, wasting even more time. Therefore, before Ji Tianxing went into seclusion, he gave the White Dragon an order. Change direction and turn northeast. Don't leave the Pantheon of Immortality's territory for the time being. White Dragon was stunned when he heard the order. He couldn't believe that his master would make such a decision. He asked Ji Tianxing, "Shizhuan, the people of the Pantheon of Immortality are searching for us everywhere. Isn't this even more dangerous?" Ji Tianxing shook his head and explained to White Dragon, "We had a big fight with those people before, so we left too many traces and wasted too much time. The undying God Emperor will definitely be able to predict our path and arrange for people to intercept us. If he continued forward, he would only be intercepted by more people, and in the end, the undying God Emperor would catch up. Changing directions at this time would catch them off guard. If they can't find us, they will gather a large number of troops at the border and wait for us. As the saying goes, it's dark under the lamp. The most dangerous place is the safest." The White Dragon was suddenly enlightened. He quickly complied and went to carry out the order. Ji Tianxing returned to the distorted spacetime and continued to cultivate in seclusion to condense the 5th Taoist rhyme. The God Slayer battleship quietly changed direction and headed northeast. The undying God Emperor didn't expect this. The God Slayer battleship headed north. The distance between the two quickly increased. 2 days later, the undying God Emperor realized that something was wrong. Firstly, his God Slayer battleship had already crossed half of the branch hall. The branch hall master and a group of elite God Slayer battleship he had arranged didn't intercept the God Slayer battleship on its original route. Secondly, he didn't see anything unusual in the escape route of the God Slayer battleship. This caused the undying God Emperor to feel extremely uneasy. As time passed, he became more and more uneasy. The situation doesn't look good. Logically speaking, I've been chasing him for 2 days. I should have caught up to him long ago. Why is he still nowhere to be seen? Could it be that he changed direction? Or did he use some kind of ultimate skill to increase the distance between us? The undying God Emperor knew that the distance between him and Ji Tianxing was originally about 1 or 2 million kilometers. With his speed, he would definitely be able to catch up to him within 2 days. Since he couldn't catch up to him and couldn't see any trace of him, something must be wrong. However, he couldn't pinpoint where the problem was, nor did he think of a solution. Helpless, he could only order the God Slayer battleship to continue forward and reach the northern border of his territory as soon as possible. The way he saw it, with so many branch hall masters and elite God Slayer battleships searching for Kenshin everywhere, the Kenshin must be thinking of a way to escape the Pantheon of Immortality's territory. Rather than blindly searching everywhere and wasting time, it was better to rush to the northern border and set up an ambush and trap in advance. Of course, carrying out this plan of waiting for the rabbit to appear by the tree stump required even more manpower and resources. As the undying God Emperor hurried along, he issued many orders. He mobilized dozens of branch hall masters and elite God Slayer battleships to carry out the mission. the Godslayer battleship rushed toward the northeast. It didn't reach its maximum speed as it still needed to divert a portion of its strength to conceal its tracks and aura. This seemed dangerous, but it was actually very safe. At the very least, the Godslayer battleship wouldn't encounter any danger for the next 20 days. Finally, under Ji Tianqing's instructions, the White Dragon stopped at the Origin Mountain branch. This branch was located in the northeast of the Pantheon of Immortality's territory. It was still one branch away from the border. If it continued to fly north for another 3 or 4 days, the Godslayer battleship would be able to leave the Pantheon of Immortality and enter the unknown. However, the Godslayer battleship hid in a mountain range with a circumference of millions of miles. This mountain range was extremely vast with numerous mountains and forests. Countless mountain ranges stretched out, like giant dragons crawling on the ground. There were countless primitive forests in the mountain range, lush and verdant. There were very few people here. The Godslayer battleship hid deep underground, quietly concealing itself. There were even aura-concealing arrays set up around it. As long as no expert from the God Emperor came here, even if a group of Godslayer battleships flew over the mountain peak, they wouldn't notice anything amiss. The White Dragon could finally rest. However, he still maintained his vigilance, guarding the surroundings. He didn't want to disappoint his master again. Ji Tianqing was still cultivating in seclusion in the distorted spacetime. He was at the crucial moment of condensing the fifth Taoist rhyme. The embryonic form of the Taoist rhyme had already been formed. He was currently fusing his insights into the heavenly Tao, as well as the divine Tao laws that he had absorbed from Lu Zhiyang and the god of the underworld. Time passed silently. The primitive mountain range was calm and peaceful. There were no changes. Another 10 days passed. Ji Tianqing cultivated in seclusion in the distorted spacetime for another year. He finally succeeded. The fifth Taoist rhyme was successfully condensed, and Ji Tianqing's strength also increased dramatically. He continued to cultivate for another 10 days before ending his closed-door cultivation. After he came out, he went to the Godslayer battleship's control room. The White Dragon had been cultivating. When he sensed his master's aura, he hurriedly stood up and bowed. Seeing that his master had successfully broken through a realm and his strength had increased greatly, the White Dragon was also very excited and hurriedly congratulated him. Then he asked his master what their next step should be. Ji Tianqing smiled and said, "A month has passed. The immortal God Emperor should have arrived at the northern border and set up traps and ambushes, right? If the people of the Taiyu Shrine are persistent enough, they should have heard the news and know what happened previously. I wonder if the two sects will meet at the northern border?" Chapter 4776. To Ji Tianqing, the greatest threats were the immortal God Emperor and the Pantheon of Immortality. However, he had far more enemies than these. The Taiyu Shrine's God Emperor also needed to be taken into consideration. He took a risk and hid in a mountain range not far from the border for a month. Using this opportunity, he successfully formed his fifth Taoist rhyme, greatly increasing his strength. A month's time was just right, within the range of his expectations and control. Not only would it give him ample time to improve his strength, but it would also give the Pantheon of Immortality and the Taiyu Shrine a chance to encounter each other. If it was possible, Ji Tianqing wanted the two shrines to fight each other, and he would be the fisherman who benefited from it. "Let's go," Ji Tianqing ordered. White Dragon steered the Godslayer out of the depths of the earth and into the air above the mountain. The formations within the warship were activated, concealing the warship's tracks and aura as it merged with the sky. White Dragon steered the Godslayer warship toward the north. Ji Tianqing sat in the pilot's cabin quietly meditating. Half a month before this, a few interesting events had occurred. First, the immortal God Emperor arrived at the northern border. Later, the temple masters arrived one after another and joined the immortal God Emperor. Afterwards, the hall masters of the various branches led large groups of elite god kings to the northern border one after another. Under the immortal God Emperor's command, they hurried to various designated locations and set up formations, traps, and ambushes with all their might. In the following days, an extremely long defensive line and an inescapable net were formed at the border. The immortal God Emperor and the temple masters spread out, each leading a large group of elite god kings to search the border. They had thought that they would be able to find the Godslayer worship and capture Kenshin after half a month of waiting. But who would have thought that after 10 days the people they waited for weren't Kenshin, but the temple masters of the Taiyu Shrine. Previously, Taiyu God Emperor had changed his mind at the last minute and headed north to hunt down the Kenshin instead of the imperishable shrine. On the way to the northern border, Taiyu God Emperor also noticed the problem and realized that Kenshin had successfully escaped. After all, he had chased all the way to the north without finding any traces of the God Emperor's great battle. This was enough to prove that the Hall Masters of the Pantheon of Immortality did not encounter the Kenshin, and the two sides did not fight. The answer was obvious. Kenshin must have escaped the pursuit of the Pantheon of Immortality. When the Taiyu Shrine was chasing after Kenshin, Kenshin had to change directions several times to shake off the Taiyu Shrine's experts. Taiyu God Emperor was well aware of Kenshin's methods and intelligence. Thus, Taiyu God Emperor knew that Kenshin must have used some sort of trick to escape, but there was nothing he could do about it. He didn't know how to find Kenshin or where to go to capture Kenshin. The safest way was to head north to the Pantheon of Immortality and wait there. Alternatively, he could find the Hall Masters of the Pantheon of Immortality and see what they would do. Just like that, the Taiyu Shrine's Hall Masters made their way to the northern border. In a majestic mountain range, Taiyu God Emperor's airship ran into a group of people searching for Kenshin. The group was led by a Hall Master and had over 1,000 elite God Kings under his command. Aboard a divine airship, these God Kings were cruising around, searching for clues and traces. When they saw an unfamiliar warship approaching, the Hall Master and the God Kings were on high alert and immediately prepared for battle. When they saw the imprint of the Taiyu Shrine on the warship, their killing intent soared and they launched an attack. The bastards of the Taiyu Shrine are here. Kill them. In the past, the two shrines had been at peace with each other. It had been tens of thousands of years since a war had broken out. But this time was different. The Taiyu Shrine's Hall Masters had invaded the Pantheon of Immortality on a large scale and stirred up trouble in their territory. This had long since angered the Immortal God Emperor. The Immortal God Emperor had issued an order to not only capture Kenshin, but also kill the Taiyu Shrine's men. Thus the warship launched an attack. Over 1,000 God Kings used their abilities and secret arts to surround and attack Taiyu God Emperor's airship. Taiyu God Emperor didn't think much of these God Kings. Even if they ran into each other, he couldn't be bothered to chase after them if they turned tail and fled. But these foes didn't know what was good for them and had taken the initiative to attack. How could Taiyu God Emperor allow them to do as they pleased? Without any hesitation, Taiyu God Emperor's airship launched a counterattack. The two warships fired their divine cannons and fired several hundred beams of divine power that clashed in the air. Bang! 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 With deafening booms, the several hundred beams of divine power shattered, filling the sky with fragments of divine light. Tens of thousands of fragments of divine light were swept up by the violent shockwaves and spread out in a five-colored ripple that spread for tens of thousands of miles. The explosions traveled far and wide, reverberating through the heavens and earth. The beams of divine power fired by the Lord-class warship were all shattered. Meanwhile, 90% of the beams fired by Taiyu God Emperor's Imperial warship were still intact, and all of them struck the Lord-class warship. The result was indisputable. The Lord-class warship's divine power barrier was shattered, and several dozen craters and large cracks appeared on its surface. The terrifying shockwaves pushed the Lord-class warship several hundred miles away and smashed it into a towering mountain. The mountain was smashed into pieces and collapsed with a rumbling noise. Dust flew everywhere and the earth shook violently. The damaged warship flickered with divine light as it tried to charge out of the ruins and escape. But then Taiyu God Emperor's airship fired again, firing several hundred more beams of divine power. Boom! 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 The next moment, several hundred beams of divine power slammed into the ruins, causing another earth-shattering explosion and endless dust. The heavily damaged Lord-class warship could no longer withstand the bombardment of the divine cannons. It shattered on the spot, sending countless fragments and wreckage flying everywhere. Several dozen unlucky elite God Kings were killed on the spot. Most of the 900 or so elite God Kings who had survived were heavily injured. Under the leadership of the Hall Master, they quickly fled the wreckage of the warship and charged out of the ruins. After witnessing the enemy's power, They lost the will to fight and no longer dared to attack. They hurriedly turned and fled. Of course, in order to escape successfully, they split into 3 different directions and scattered. Even though Taiyu God Emperor's airship gave chase, it couldn't capture them all in one fell swoop. It only killed 300 or so elite god kings before ending the pursuit. This matter was over. This was originally just a small interlude that didn't affect the big picture. However, the 600 or so elite divine kings who had managed to escape hurriedly sent out messages to the immortal God Emperor and the Hall Masters in their joy at surviving the calamity. In less than 15 minutes, the immortal God Emperor and the Hall Masters learned that the people of the Taiyu Shrine had arrived. Chapter 4777. The immortal God Emperor hated the Taiyu Shrine to the core. His hatred for them was second only to that of Kenshin. Learning that the Taiyu Shrine had arrived, the immortal God Emperor's expression darkened, his eyes blazing with fury. You've gone too far. Not only did you barge into my territory to stir up trouble, you even dared to chase me all the way here. You're looking down on me. Taiyu old man, I'll make sure you pay the price this time. The immortal God Emperor clenched his fists and ordered the other temple lords to meet the Taiyu God Emperor. As for capturing Kenshin, he could only put it aside for the time being. In any case, the border defenses were still there, and the temple lords and elite god kings were still on their missions, searching everywhere for Kenshin. It wasn't a bad strategy to deal with the Taiyu Shrine first and then deal with the Kenshin later. Half a day later, the immortal God Emperor summoned the 4 temple lords and led 5,000 elite god kings to the scene of the incident. Of course, they knew that the Taiyu God Emperor had already left the scene. But the immortal God Emperor believed that the Taiyu God Emperor was still nearby. As expected, the immortal God Emperor and the 4 temple lords arrived at the scene of the incident and began searching the area. A day later, the immortal God Emperor encountered the Taiyu Shrine's worship. 2 temple lords were with the immortal God Emperor. The Taiyu Shrine also had 2 warships, the Taiyu God Emperor and the 6th temple lord. The 4th and 5th temple lords had yet to recover from their injuries and were still recovering in the Taiyu God Emperor's worship. The 2nd and 3rd temple lords traveled together, searching for Kenshin's tracks and clues tens of millions of kilometers away. The 2 sides met and faced each other in the sky. The undying God Emperor's side had the advantage in numbers. The 3 warships were arranged in a battle formation, and their momentum was overbearing. The great universe God Emperor's side only had 2 warships and 2,000 elite god kings. Their numbers were small. However, Taiyu God Emperor was strong and confident. He wasn't afraid at all. The 2 god emperors sent out messages to gather the other palace masters. They wanted to gather all of their forces and destroy the other party. Without sufficient confidence, both sides would not attack with all their might. Both sides had reserved their trump cards. Even after the 2 sides had confronted each other for a while, they had begun to attack and defend, but most of them were probing attacks. The 5 battleships circled around in the sky, shooting out dazzling beams of divine power that locked onto the enemy's battleships. The 2 sides exchanged blows back and forth. Loud sounds of battle shook the heavens, and divine light covered the sky and covered the sun. On the surface, it looked very lively, as if the battle was very intense. But in reality, both sides were probing and dodging, so they didn't cause too much damage to each other. After an hour of fighting, only a few of the warship's divine power barriers had been broken. 3 of them had been blasted into holes and cracks. The elite god kings in the warships didn't suffer any casualties. Emperor God Taiyu wasn't satisfied with the outcome, but he was also worried. He could see that the undying God Emperor was stalling for time, waiting for reinforcements to arrive before attacking with all his might. He couldn't delay any longer. The 2nd and 3rd palace masters were tens of millions of kilometers away, and it would take them at least 2 hours to arrive. With less than an hour left, his reinforcements wouldn't arrive. If the undying God Emperor's reinforcements arrived, things would be very bad. Thus, Taiyu God Emperor decisively ordered a retreat. Both he and the 6th palace master's warships fought and retreated toward the northwest. The 2nd and 3rd palace masters were in the northwest, rushing over with all their might. Only by rushing in both directions could they meet up in the shortest time possible. Seeing Taiyu God Emperor fleeing, the undying God Emperor naturally wouldn't let him go and gave chase with all his might. In any case, the other two palace masters would arrive soon. All he needed to do was delay Taiyu God Emperor so that he could surround him and win with numbers. Just like that, the two sides clashed high in the sky, constantly shifting battlefields. Half an hour later, the two sides had moved millions of kilometers away, leaving behind countless ruins, collapsed mountains, and destroyed forests. Taiyu God Emperor couldn't shake off the undying God Emperor's entanglement, and both sides' warships suffered varying degrees of damage. It was at this point that the two Pantheon of Immortality caught up. The undying God Emperor and the four palace masters had gathered. 5 warships arranged themselves in a formation, surrounding Taiyu God Emperor and the 6th palace master. The Pantheon of Immortality's side had a great boost in morale, while Taiyu God Emperor's side was filled with worry. In order to fend off the Pantheon of Immortality's encirclement, Taiyu God Emperor, who had yet to personally take action, had no choice but to use all sorts of abilities. Countless streaks of divine light danced in the sky, intertwining with each other and exploding with deafening booms. Taiyu God Emperor's abilities successfully neutralized the enemy's attack, protecting his and the 6th palace master's worship. Seeing this, the undying God Emperor led the 4 palace masters into action, using their trump cards to surround Taiyu God Emperor and the 6th palace master. Soon after, the situation on the battlefield changed. The 5 God Emperor experts on the Pantheon of Immortality's side worked together to surround Taiyu God Emperor and the 6th palace master. The 5 warships also formed an encirclement and attacked the 2 enemy warships with all their might. The elite god kings in the various warships also charged out of their ships and lined up in the sky to fight each other. Even though Emperor God Taiyu was very strong, he couldn't take on so many enemies at once. He was forced to retreat again and again. The 6th palace master was even more unlucky. He was the weaker one to begin with, and now that he was surrounded by multiple God Emperor experts, he was soon beaten into a sorry state and covered in wounds. The battle quickly became one-sided. Taiyu God Emperor's side was completely suppressed. The 2,000 elite god kings under his command suffered a large number of casualties. More and more people died in battle. It seemed like the scales of victory were tipping in favor of the Pantheon of Immortality. In at most an hour, Taiyu God Emperor's side would suffer a crushing defeat. His 2,000 god kings and the 6th palace master would all be killed. Only Taiyu God Emperor would be able to escape with his life after suffering grievous injuries. However, it was at this moment that Taiyu God Emperor's reinforcements arrived. 2 divine warships came from the northwest like shooting stars, whistling through the air. The masters of the 2 warships were the 2nd and 3rd palace masters of the Taiyu Shrine. There were also 1,000 god kings on each ship. After the 2 palace masters arrived at the battlefield, they joined the battle without saying a word. With the help of these 2 powerhouses, Taiyu God Emperor and the 6th palace master felt much less pressure and could finally breathe a sigh of relief. This was especially so for the 6th palace master, who was heavily injured and covered in blood. He felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. Even though the Taiyu Shrine side only had 4 God Emperor experts, they still didn't have the advantage in numbers. However, Taiyu God Emperor was stronger. With the help of the 2nd and 3rd palace masters, he quickly turned the situation around. The 2 sides were evenly matched and gradually reached a stalemate. Thus, Taiyu God Emperor took the initiative to call a truce and negotiate with the immortal God Emperor. Chapter 4778. Since the Universe God Emperor didn't want to fight and was willing to negotiate, the immortal God Emperor naturally wouldn't refuse. In any case, the 2 sides were evenly matched. Continuing to fight would only wear each other down and increase casualties. In addition, the immortal God Emperor wanted to see what the Universe God Emperor wanted to talk about. The 2 fleets faced each other in the sky, separated by tens of thousands of miles. They were within range of the divine cannons and had plenty of time to react and dodge. In order to show his sincerity, the Universe God Emperor stepped out of the warship and stood in front of the fleet. The 2nd and 3rd palace masters followed him out of the ship. They stood behind the 1st palace master and stared at each other expressionlessly. As for the 4th, 5th, and 6th lords, they remained in the warship to recover from their injuries and didn't show themselves. Seeing that the other side was in position, the immortal God Emperor leisurely stepped out of the warship and stood in front of the fleet. The 4 lords followed behind him in a row, their faces filled with arrogance as they coldly stared at the other side. The fact that both sides had reached this point in the negotiation showed that they were evenly matched and weren't willing to fight to the death. However, this was the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality, and they had the advantage in numbers. Thus, the immortal God Emperor's lords appeared even more confident and arrogant. Immortal, although you and I haven't interacted for nearly 20,000 years, we both know each other's nature and methods, don't we? Universe God Emperor was the first to speak, calmly looking at the immortal God Emperor. The immortal God Emperor sneered and said in an unfriendly tone, "Old man Universe, you're stronger than us and you're also very shrewd. All the temple lords are well aware of this. However, our immortal God Emperor has never been afraid of you. You, on the other hand, are pushing your luck by invading this emperor's territory on a large scale. If you don't give this emperor an explanation today, don't blame this emperor for fighting to the death with you." Even if the immortal God Emperor knew full well that he might not be able to do anything to Taiyu God Emperor, he had to have enough momentum. God Emperor Taiyu knew him too well and merely smiled when he heard this. "Boom, yeah, you don't have to play dumb with this emperor. Everyone knows that this emperor didn't come here to fight with you and snatch your territory. If it weren't for the fact that I was chasing that brat Kenshin, why would I barge into your territory? If it weren't for Kenshin destroying your divine palace and killing your temple master, why would you muster such a large force and go to war? In the end, we have a common enemy, and that is the Kenshin." But if he could do that, the immortal God Emperor could also return the favor by barging into the Taiyu Shrine's territory and doing something even worse. Just as expected, the immortal God Emperor instantly understood Taiyu God Emperor's intentions and sneered. "Old Taiyu, of course this emperor can guess that you want to turn this emperor's territory upside down. But don't forget that this emperor can do what you can do. In fact, if you really do make a move, this emperor will return the favor several times over." Taiyu God Emperor was enraged by the other party's nonchalant attitude. He wanted nothing more than to kill the other party. But he knew very well that he couldn't lose his composure or lose his temper at a time like this. He also couldn't easily give up on this negotiation. He could only assume that the immortal God Emperor was intentionally provoking him or testing his sincerity. Left with no choice, Taiyu God Emperor could only rub his forehead and ask with a pained expression, "Immortal, what are you trying to do? Do we really have to talk in such an awkward manner?" The immortal God Emperor shrugged and sneered. "Old Taiyu, don't get it wrong. You're the one who's playing tricks and refusing to tell this emperor the truth. How can this emperor cooperate with you? This emperor will ask you one last time. Do you want to kill Kenshin because you want to chase him or because you want to kill him?" Taiyu God Emperor originally didn't want to reveal the truth and wanted to hold back until he met with Ji Tianxing. But the immortal God Emperor didn't buy it. He wanted to force the other party to speak clearly or he wouldn't give Taiyu God Emperor a promise. Taiyu God Emperor hesitated and weighed the pros and cons. In the end, he told the immortal God Emperor the truth. "That's right. This emperor did come to your territory to capture Kenshin for another reason. But as for what it is, this emperor can't tell you yet." Chapter 4779. The Taiyu God Emperor could only admit that he had other reasons for invading the Pantheon of Immortality's territory. However, he was unwilling to reveal the truth and his true thoughts. The immortal God Emperor didn't mince his words. "Taiyu, old man, don't play this game with me. Seize and seize. I know what you're thinking. But if you don't tell me, I'll take it as a lack of sincerity. What cooperation? Let's keep fighting. This emperor would like to see how many of you can walk out of this emperor's territory alive." The immortal God Emperor looked especially mighty, domineering, and confident. Though he wasn't necessarily Taiyu God Emperor's match, he could summon an army of thousands and mount a never-ending siege on the Taiyu Shrine's powerhouses. As long as he set his mind to it, he could wipe out the Taiyu Shrine's powerhouses no matter the price he had to pay. Even if there were some who managed to escape in the end, there would only be a handful of them. The Taiyu God Emperor was sure to be one of them. The 4 temple lords had all reached the upper God Emperor realm. 3 of them had condensed 7 Taoist rhymes, while the Taiyu God Emperor had condensed 8. In terms of strength, no one dared boast that they could kill or capture the Taiyu God Emperor. However, the immortal God Emperor was willing to sacrifice tens of thousands of elite God Kings to kill the Taiyu Shrine's temple lords. There was a good chance he could achieve this. The Taiyu God Emperor understood this as well, so he naturally wouldn't take the immortal God Emperor's words lightly. He frowned fiercely and glared at the immortal God Emperor. He scolded, "Immortal, you're doing this knowingly. You're ignoring this emperor. If you really want to fight, don't blame me for being merciless and turning your territory upside down." He guessed that when the immortal God Emperor went all out, he would gather countless elite God Kings to besiege them. Even if he had to pay a high price, he would still annihilate the Hall Masters. However, he was confident that he could bring the Temple Masters out of danger and leave the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. In the worst-case scenario, all the elite God Kings accompanying them would die in battle. It seemed that both sides were ready for a showdown and a great battle was about to start. The immortal God Emperor frowned and suppressed his anger for the time being. He said solemnly, "I'll give you one last chance, old man Taiyu. You spent so much effort searching for Kenshin. Is it to kill him for revenge or to take him under your wing?" This time his tone was sharper and heavier than before. Taiyu God Emperor knew that the immortal God Emperor's patience was running out. This was definitely his last chance. If he answered truthfully, there would still be a chance for negotiation. If he continued to be perfunctory, there would be nothing left to talk about. They would have to shed all pretense of cordiality and start a war. After a moment of hesitation, Taiyu God Emperor said, "Immortal, you and I both know the answer. Kenshin is no ordinary God Emperor. Given his strength and cultivation, he has so many tricks and schemes. His talent and aptitude are rare in the world. Not to mention the 20-odd Hall Masters of the 4 sacred halls. Even I am ashamed of my inferiority. Therefore you should understand what I mean." Since Taiyu God Emperor had backed down, the immortal God Emperor didn't press the issue. 30,000 years ago you mentioned the phrase, "the chosen one." You said yourself that only the chosen one can ignite the eternal flame and open the door to the heavenly Tao, unlocking the mysteries of immortality. In that case, you already have enough confidence to confirm that the Sword God is the one chosen by the heavens? Is that why you're going through so much trouble to take him under your wing? Taiyu God Emperor didn't answer directly. You're asking a question you already know the answer to. In fact, isn't that why you're searching for him at all costs? At this point, both sides were basically admitting to it. The immortal God Emperor nodded. "Good, as long as you admit it. Since we both want to capture Kenshin and use him to open the door to the heavenly Tao, I'll ask you one question. If we capture Kenshin, how should we split the spoils?" Taiyu God Emperor wanted to say that whoever captured Kenshin had the right to deal with him. But on second thought, the immortal God Emperor had a better chance of capturing Kenshin in the Pantheon of Immortality's territory. At that time, if Kenshin was really captured by the immortal God Emperor, would he just stand by and watch? Taiyu God Emperor didn't dare guarantee that, nor did he believe he could hold back. Thus he chose a compromise. "We'll work together. No matter who captures Kenshin, we'll discuss how to deal with Kenshin together. Even if we have to go to the Chaos Sea and open the door to the heavenly Tao, we'll go together." Taiyu God Emperor spoke with a solemn expression. The immortal God Emperor waved his hand and sneered disdainfully. "That's easy for you to say, old man Taiyu. If you capture Kenshin first, will you tell this emperor? Don't tell me you will, I won't believe it." This. Taiyu God Emperor was at a loss for words, unable to answer this question. Of course, if he captured Kenshin, he wouldn't tell the immortal God Emperor either. He'd definitely take Kenshin away in secret. Then he'd find a suitable time to take Kenshin to the Chaos Sea and try to open the door to the heavenly Tao. However, he couldn't fool the immortal God Emperor. Even if he said he would do it, the God Emperor wouldn't believe him. Xianxia Pavilion. There was no foundation of trust between the two, which made it difficult for them to reach a consensus. Taiyu God Emperor pondered for a moment with a frown. "Immortal, since you and I don't trust each other, I'd like to hear your opinion." The immortal God Emperor smirked. "It's simple, whoever captures Kenshin first has the right to deal with him. Before that, we just need to stop fighting and killing each other." This was undoubtedly the most beneficial decision for the immortal God Emperor. This was his territory and there were soldiers under his command everywhere. He had at least a 70% chance of capturing Kenshin, while Taiyu God Emperor only had a 30% chance. Both God Emperor and the immortal God Emperor were well aware of this. Moreover, the immortal God Emperor was full of confidence and wasn't afraid that Taiyu God Emperor wouldn't agree. As expected, Taiyu God Emperor furrowed his brows, feeling indignant but unable to resolve the issue. After a moment of silence, he nodded. Fine. Immortal, this emperor agrees to your conditions. I hope you'll remember our agreement. As for who can capture Kenshin, that'll depend on their own abilities. A victorious smile appeared on the immortal god emperor's face as he nodded his head in agreement. Of course, let's be frank. This emperor and my soldiers can pretend we didn't see you. However, we've already set up traps, ambushes, and defensive lines, so please don't approach. If you want to capture Kenshin, you'll have to rely on your own abilities. Don't even think about borrowing this emperor's strength. Chapter 4780. The immortal god emperor's words sounded reasonable. If he didn't oppose the Taiyu god emperor, the two sides would have reached an agreement. If the Taiyu god emperor wanted to capture Kenshin, he would have to rely on his own power and influence. How could he borrow the power of the Pantheon of Immortality? Even if the Taiyu god emperor sent someone to observe the situation and wait for the Pantheon of Immortality to discover Kenshin, he still wouldn't allow it. This request left the Taiyu god emperor extremely conflicted and furious. He had no choice. If he didn't agree, the Pantheon of Immortality would do everything in his power to send out groups of experts to surround them. But if he agreed, he wouldn't be able to set foot on the northern border for tens of millions of kilometers. This was equivalent to handing over the initiative to the Pantheon of Immortality. Perhaps he could refuse, but he wouldn't be able to continue negotiating with the immortal god emperor. Negotiations between the two sides broke down. Who told him to be the one to negotiate first? It was only natural that he would be at a disadvantage. The two sides reached an agreement, but they parted on bad terms. The Taiyu god emperor left with his fleet in a huff. After returning to the starship, his face was filled with anger as he clenched his fists and cursed fiercely. "Boomia, you dog, you actually dare to bully this emperor? Once I capture Kenshin, I'll teach him a lesson." The second and third hallmasters were also furious. They wanted nothing more than to tear the immortal god emperor to pieces. In their eyes, the first hallmaster was the leader of the 4 sacred halls and should be respected and revered by everyone. But now he'd suffered such a great loss in front of the immortal god emperor. It was truly abominable. The second hallmaster frowned in thought. He couldn't help but whisper, "First hallmaster, do you think the immortal emperor will keep his word? Do we really have to leave their defenses?" He wouldn't be satisfied if they really had to keep their word. He felt that this matter could be manipulated a little. But Emperor Taiyu waved his hand and said in a low voice, "Immortal may be despicable, but he's not an idiot. The fact that he's tolerated our invasion to this extent is already a sign of his rationality and self-restraint. If we go back on our word, he'll lose his rationality even if it's for the sake of face. He'll gather a large force to annihilate us. Otherwise, where's his prestige and dignity?" The second and third hallmasters were speechless, not knowing what to say. Indeed, if they were the immortal god emperors, they would also recklessly start a war for the dignity and prestige of the hallmaster. Not for anything else, but to let the people see and believe that the temple had the ability and determination to protect everyone. After a moment of silence, the third palace master was still unwilling to give up. He asked, "Are we going to leave just like that? Search aimlessly?" The Taiyu god emperor shook his head again. "It's not that aimless. Don't underestimate the Kenshin. The immortal god emperor has set up a perimeter of tens of millions of miles. It'll be the hardest to catch the Kenshin. In comparison, it'll be easier for us to find traces and clues if we search the safer areas." The second and third hallmasters thought about it carefully and felt that this was indeed the case. Next, they split into 2 teams and began to search and explore several branches in the border area. For safety's sake, the second and third hallmasters formed a team while the Taiyu god emperor moved alone. The injured 4th, 5th, and 6th hallmasters stayed in the Taiyu god emperor's warship. They kept their search area within the Pantheon of Immortality's perimeter. They basically didn't run into the Pantheon of Immortality. In addition, their warships hid their auras and tracks. Zhou Xian headed straight for the northern border of the Pantheon of Immortality. It only took him 2 days to cross a hall and arrive near the border. Another 1,000,000 miles to the north and they would pass through this branch, leave the territory of the Immortal Temple and enter the unknown. He had already discovered the Pantheon of Immortality and the movements of many elite god kings in this region. In truth, the perimeter that the immortal god emperor had painstakingly set up stretched for 15 million miles, but it was to the left of Tianqing's front. The northern border was very long and that perimeter was right in the middle. Tianqing was to the northeast. The god emperor experts in charge of this perimeter were the third and fifth hallmasters of the pantheon of immortality. The two hallmasters had long since gathered 12 hallmasters and more than 10,000 elite god kings under their command. A portion of them were defending the border, maintaining numerous traps and arrays. The other half were patrolling and searching for clues. The god-slaying warship concealed its aura and tracks, and it also slowed down. It leisurely traversed mountains and rivers, heading north. In 4 hours, Tianqing encountered 4 groups of people. They were all hallmasters of the various halls. They were leading hundreds, if not thousands, of elite god kings as they searched the area. Tianqing ignored these people. The god-slaying warship brushed past these 4 groups without being discovered. His goal was not to eliminate ordinary god kings, but to find the hallmasters of the pantheon of immortality and the hallmasters of the Taiyu shrine. He wanted to see if the hallmasters of the 2 great halls had encountered each other and if they had engaged in a battle that would give him an opportunity to take advantage of. Therefore, the god-slaying warship was not in a hurry to leave the territory of the pantheon of immortality. It also cruised within the borders. 8 hours later, the god-slaying warship had traveled 1,000,000 miles in the northwest direction. Tianqing finally encountered the first god emperor expert, the 5th hallmaster of the pantheon of immortality. The 5th hallmaster oversaw the border. He stayed in his warship and commanded many hallmasters and thousands of elite god kings. His warship also cruised continuously, and the soldiers under his command remained vigilant. Not far behind the warship was the perimeter where the experts had gathered. Arrays were set up in various mountain ranges, and there were also various traps and ambushes. Tianqing secretly followed the 5th hallmaster and observed him for a while before leaving quietly. Based on the current situation, he could basically guess that the pantheon of immortality had put in all his effort to set up the perimeter and capture him at all costs. However, the 5th hallmaster's behavior made it difficult for him to confirm whether the pantheon of immortality and the people of the Taiyu shrine had engaged in a battle or not. Tianqing continued to rush towards the northwest, wanting to find out more about the situation. After a few more hours, he made further progress. Other than meeting a few hallmasters and elite god kings, he also met a god emperor expert. It was the 3rd hallmaster of the pantheon of immortality. The 3rd hallmaster's situation was similar to the 5th hallmaster's. He also sat in the warship and silently patrolled the border while commanding many hallmasters and elite god kings. As his strength was similar to the 3rd hallmaster's, Tianqing could not be too obvious or too close to the 3rd hallmaster. He could not eavesdrop on the 3rd hallmaster's orders. He could only observe the other party's direction and the movements of the soldiers to determine the specific situation. Chapter 4781. The Pantheon of Immortality has mobilized at least tens of thousands of god kings to create such a scene at the border. They're really sparing no expense. With such a huge commotion, it's impossible for the Taiyu shrine to miss it if they rush over. However, the 2 Pantheon of Immortality are still so relaxed and calm. Could it be that they haven't met or fought? In the cockpit of the god-slaying battleship, Tianqing frowned and analyzed the situation. White Dragon focused on steering the battleship and cautiously observed the surroundings. Hearing his master's muttering, he thought for a moment and asked, "Master, could it be that the Taiyu Shrine's people have come, but after seeing the Pantheon of Immortality, they hid and didn't show up?" Tianqing thought for a moment and shook his head. With my understanding of the Taiyu God Emperor, he wouldn't do that. He would definitely use the power of the Pantheon of Immortality to hide and observe the situation. Once the Pantheon of Immortality discovers our tracks, the Taiyu God Emperor will jump out to intercept us. However, the Pantheon of Immortality isn't stupid. If the Taiyu Shrine's people hide nearby, they will definitely discover them and clash. White Dragon frowned and said with a troubled expression, "Master, we're now in a 3-way game with the Taiyu Shrine and the Pantheon of Immortality. You, the Taiyu God Emperor, and the Pantheon of Immortality are all experts with great foresight. Your deduction and calculation is really a bit troublesome. What do you think we should do next? Should we directly leave the Pantheon of Immortality's territory and head to the Chaos Sea? Or should we continue to search the border and find a chance to start a war between the two shrines? Ji Tianxing was silent. He pondered and analyzed for a while before dispelling the fog and deducing the truth. In the past month or so, the Taiyu Shrine and the Pantheon of Immortality must have come into contact with each other. Later, when I kill a team and capture a Hall Master for interrogation, I will be able to verify this point. Since the experts of the two temples had come into contact, and yet nothing had happened, it could only mean that they had reached a consensus. They even wanted to capture me, so they reached some kind of agreement or cooperation. At this point, Ji Tianxing already had an answer in his heart. If the experts of the two temples were to kill each other, he would still have a chance to stir up trouble and take advantage of the situation. But now that the experts of the two temples had reached an agreement, there was no longer any chance for him to succeed. If he showed up rashly, he would be besieged by the powerhouses of the two temples, and his ending would be miserable. Bai Long listened to his master's analysis and showed a hint of surprise. He couldn't help but ask, "Master, it can't be. Didn't the Taiyu Shrine and the Pantheon of Immortality hold grudges against each other for a long time? How could they reach an agreement and cooperate?" Ji Tianxing waved his hand and said, "You don't understand the nature of the Taiyu God Emperor and the Immortal God Emperor. Four overlords like them, as long as it's not a matter of life and death, there's no real grudge between them. As long as they have a common goal and benefit, they can negotiate and negotiate. Alright, let's not go forward anymore. Turn east and go around their defense line." Bai Long thought about it and agreed. After all, he had followed his master for so many years and had seen many similar things. He didn't say anything else and hurriedly controlled the Godslayer battleship to turn east. 12 hours later, the Godslayer battleship reached the easternmost part of the defense line. If they went any further, they would be far away from the Pantheon of Immortality's defense line. At this time, the Godslayer battleship encountered the last group of people. It was still a Hall Master leading a few hundred elite God Kings in a battleship. Ji Tianxing gave the order, and Bai Long decisively opened fire and launched an attack. Boom 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 boom. When the invisible Godslayer battleship was 20,000 miles away from the battleship, it suddenly shot out more than 300 beams of divine power. Dazzling divine light filled the sky and loud explosions shook the heavens. The 300 beams of light poured down like a rain of arrows and immediately engulfed the battleship. It was a top-grade King-level battleship that had been cruising in the vicinity for a month and had been safe and sound. The people controlling the battleship, the Hall Master and the elite God Kings in the battleship weren't prepared for a sudden attack at all. When they saw the incoming beams of divine power, they were filled with fear and shock. It was too late for them to dodge even if they wanted to. With a series of loud bangs, the defensive light shield of the battleship was shattered into pieces, bursting into countless fragments of divine light. Dozens of craters appeared on the battleship's surface as well as a few wide cracks. More than a dozen unlucky elite God Kings were struck by the beams of divine power that pierced through the battleship and died on the spot. The sudden attack caused the Hall Master and the elite God Kings to turn pale with fright. They didn't hesitate to control the battleship and flee into the distance. The Godslayer battleship was already prepared. It sped up and chased after them. It activated its divine cannon again and released more than 300 beams of light. Another loud rumbling sound erupted. The already damaged battleship was broken into 3 sections on the spot, scattering countless fragments and metal pieces. More than 100 unlucky elite God Kings were killed on the spot by the Godslayer battleship. The remaining 600 or so elite God Kings also fled the wreckage of the battleship pathetically and assembled in the sky. At this moment, Ji Tianxing stepped out of the Godslayer battleship. He held the Sword of Burial of Heaven and attacked personally. The moment they saw him appear, the Hall Master and the hundreds of elite God Kings were filled with fear and despair. They never expected that the Pantheon of Immortality would go all out to capture Kenshin. Dozens of Hall Masters and tens of thousands of elite God Kings didn't encounter Kenshin, but they did. Originally, this was their lucky day and also their chance to perform meritorious deeds. However, they were no match for Kenshin and would definitely be slaughtered. Therefore no one could feel happy. Instead they were filled with despair. They watched as Kenshin sped over and brandished his divine sword, creating a sky full of sword gleams. Knowing that they were going to die, the Hall Master decisively made the wisest choice. That was to get the soldiers to scatter and escape in all directions. He wanted as many survivors as possible. At the same time, he took out his communication jade slip and reported the situation to the Hall Masters. He only had one thought in his mind, and that was, he and the soldiers could die here, but he had to spread the news. Swish, 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 swish. The Hall Master had just sent out his communication jade slip when the sky full of sword gleams slashed down and enveloped everyone. Boom, 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 boom. A series of muffled sounds erupted, reverberating between heaven and earth. One by one, the elite god kings were sliced into pieces by the resplendent golden sword gleams. Blood and flesh splattered all over the sky. Mournful howls and roars of pain reverberated between heaven and earth. After the sky full of sword gleams dissipated, only about 400 of the elite god kings were left of the original 600 or so. Tianxia struck out with the dragon elephant divine fist again, creating a sky full of sword gleams as he continued to pursue and kill everyone. The elite god kings who were lucky enough to survive panicked and fled in all directions. In the end, only about 20 god kings managed to escape. The Hall Master was captured by Tianxia and the rest were killed. Chapter 4782. The White Dragons steered the god-slaying warship around the Pantheon of Immortality's defensive line and continued to fly north. Tianxia captured the Hall Master and entered the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Tower to interrogate him. He gave the Hall Master a chance to confess, but the Hall Master was stubborn and would rather die than submit. He even threatened that the Pantheon of Immortality would not let him go. Tianxia did not waste any time. He killed the Hall Master and refined his divinity in the distorted space-time, robbing him of his memories. Compared to extorting a confession by torture, this would waste more time, but it was also the most violent and efficient method. Tianxia spent 5 days in the distorted space-time to refine the Hall Master's divinity and obtain his memories. Even though this Hall Master had never participated in any major battles and had never seen the immortal God Emperor with his own eyes since joining this operation, he had never personally seen him. However, he knew some insider information and the operation plan of the Hall Masters. Just as Tianxia had guessed not long ago, the Taiyu Shrine and the Pantheon of Immortality had a major battle. However, the battle did not cause too many casualties. Neither side lost a Hall Master, only more than 1,000 elite god kings died. Later on, for some reason, the two sides stopped fighting. After that, the Lord Hall Master ordered all the Hall Masters who participated in the operation to guard the northern border and not relax. At the same time, they only needed to search for Kenshin and were not to make things difficult for the Taiyu Shrine's people. Of course, if the Taiyu Shrine's people approached the defensive line or wandered around nearby, they would not be polite. As a Hall Master, this person did not know why the Lord Hall Master made this decision and what kind of communication between the two great halls. However, when Tianxia received the news, he showed an expression of, "I knew it," and sneered in his heart. He knew the Taiyu God Emperor and the Immortal God Emperor very well and guessed that the two God Emperors would stop fighting, communicate and negotiate before finally coming to an agreement. Since that was the case, leaving the Pantheon of Immortality's territory as soon as possible and not showing up was the right choice. After leaving the distorted space-time, Tianxia returned to the cockpit of the god-slaying warship and ordered the White Dragon, full speed ahead and enter the unknown land as soon as possible. The White Dragon did not ask for the reason and only followed the order. In his heart, he knew very well that his master must have verified his conjecture, which was why he was so certain. Moreover, his master had just killed a group of elite god kings. The lords of Pantheon of Immortality must have received the news and were rushing over with all their might. At this time, they had to escape and enter the unknown land as soon as possible. Warship's Immortality's territory. An immortality. An immortality as territory. Of immortality. The mountains here were steeper, the forests were deeper, and the sky was filled with fog. There were harsh environments and traps everywhere. Without a doubt, this was a mysterious place that even the immortal temple had not been able to conquer. After entering the unknown land, the god-slaying warship did not let down its guard. It remained cautious, concealing its tracks and aura. The development of the situation was in line with Tianxia's expectations. Before that Hall Lord died, he sent a jade slip to the second Hall Lord. Soon the other hall lords received the news. The hall masters were currently commanding the various elite god kings to search the defensive line in full swing. The sudden news excited the hall lords. Without a word, they led their soldiers to the scene of the incident. The immortal god emperor was able to remain calm even though he was excited. He frowned in thought and seriously analyzed the situation. I thought that if that guy went north he would have to pass through our defensive line. I didn't expect him to circle around to the northeast. Since that's the case, he wouldn't have stayed after killing those soldiers. He would have headed north in a straight line and fled into the unknown land as quickly as possible. Since that's the case, there's no point in us rushing to the scene of the incident. He's long gone. Only a fool would wait for us to surround him. It was a very simple logic. The immortal god emperor immediately ordered the hall lords to head northeast and enter the unknown land as quickly as possible to search for traces and clues left behind by Xianxia. The moment anyone found a definite clue, they were to immediately inform him and the hall lords. This way he could accurately grasp Xianxia's movements and determine Xianxia's intentions. After receiving the order, the hall lords changed directions and carried out their orders. As a result, the Pantheon of Immortality once again turned out in full force. The 5 hall masters led close to 6,000 elite god kings towards the north as fast as lightning. In addition, the hall lords of the various halls also received orders to quickly assemble at the northern border. Although they had many people without a god emperor leading them, they were relatively weak. The immortal god emperor ordered them to assemble. Every 5 hall lords would form an elite army of 5,000 and enter the unknown land together. This way each army would have a considerable fighting strength. Even if they encountered a god emperor, they would be able to put up a fight. The immortal god emperor, the 2nd hall lord and the 3rd hall lord had been roaming around the border, searching for Zhou Xian's whereabouts. The immortal god emperor had forbidden them from approaching the defense line. But how could the immortal god emperor obediently obey? He still had a backup plan. He had arranged for a group of elite scouts to roam around the defense line and gather information. In less than half an hour after the incident, the scouts sensed the unusual movements of the indestructible shrine. Seeing that the hall lords of the various halls were leading large groups of elite god kings away from the defense line and toward the north, the scouts hurriedly reported the news to the immortal god emperor. The immortal god emperor had been paying attention to the immortal god emperor's movements this entire time. Upon receiving this news, he immediately ordered his soldiers to head north. He was well aware that the immortal god emperor had been lying in wait all this time. Now that he had suddenly turned out in full force and was heading north, it had to be to hunt down Xianxia. In other words, Xianxia had already appeared and clashed with the Pantheon of Immortality. The immortal god emperor must have known about Xianxia's whereabouts to give this order. Thus, the immortal god emperor, the 2nd hall lord and the 3rd hall lord took their warships and headed north as quickly as possible. Several months ago, the experts of the 2 halls of immortality had joined forces to hunt down Xianxia. Things had calmed down for several months, but now the same thing was happening once more. The immortal god emperor planned to maintain his cooperation with the immortal god emperor for the time being. At the very least, he wouldn't have a falling out on the surface. But in reality, once both sides entered the unknown lands, they would have to act according to the situation. The immortal god emperor was treacherous. He had clearly discovered Xianxia's whereabouts, but he wasn't willing to tell him. If he had the chance in the future, he would definitely take revenge on the immortal god emperor when he was in the unknown lands. Chapter 4783. Zhou Xian did not know much about the unknown land north of the Pantheon of Immortality. He had only seen a map not long ago and knew the approximate size of this region. However, he did not know what mysteries lay in this unknown land and which god emperor powerhouses occupied it. However, based on his past experience of traveling through the unknown land, there were at most 2 or 3 god emperor beast overlords in this region. Zhou Xian did not have much to worry about when entering the unknown land. The only ones he was wary of were the powerhouses of the Taiyu Shrine and the Pantheon of Immortality. He needed to calculate how long it would take for the powerhouses of the 2 shrines to catch up to him. At the same time, he had to ensure that no accidents would occur after entering the unknown land and that he would not waste too much time. The 2 divine halls and him, the 3 forces, were not mediocre. They all had enough wisdom and means. But in the end it would still require some luck and opportunity to reap the benefits. However, it was obvious that the heavens would not always favor Ji Tianxing. He could not always be lucky. After entering the unknown land, the god-slaying battleship had only flown for half a day when something unexpected happened. Beast tribe powerhouses had set up an ambush along the god-slaying battleship's path. When the god-slaying battleship passed by a majestic mountain range and flew over a lush forest, something unexpected happened. Swish, 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 swish. A dazzling light lit up in the forest. Divine light that blotted out the sky suddenly appeared and formed several huge light shields, forming a terrifying array formation. 3 layers of divine light shields with a radius of 10,000 miles enveloped the god-slaying battleship. They released a terrifying suppressive force that suppressed the god-slaying battleship. As a result, the god-slaying battleship's flying speed was reduced by 30%. Its altitude also dropped by a few hundred feet. Immediately after, thousands of beast tribe powerhouses flew out from the forest in all directions. In the blink of an eye, they formed a circle and surrounded the god-slaying battleship. A giant beast as large as a mountain flew out from the dense forest. It stood high in the sky and looked down at the god-slaying battleship from above. "Who are you? How dare you invade my territory? Are you courting death?" The celestial arch-god beast, which was covered in golden fur and looked like a lion, opened its bloody mouth and roared loudly. Within the god-slaying battleship, Ji Tianxing frowned as he looked at the divine beast lord in the sky. He muttered to himself, "How could this be? Wasn't this too much of a coincidence? We just entered the unknown lands not long ago. How did we encounter a beast overlord?" In his mind, this unknown land was so vast that even if there were 3 to 5 overlords, they should have occupied a large territory. The god-slaying battleship would need to travel for at least 2 days before it would pass by the lair of a certain beast overlord. This beast overlord had appeared far too early and had even set up traps and ambushes. This was far too abnormal. Thus, Ji Tianxing decided to test the waters. He flew out of the god-slaying battleship and into the sky. He faced off against the lion-like beast overlord and said in a low voice, "How should I address you? I am just passing by and have no ill intentions. I wonder why you have set up an ambush here and attacked my battleship?" It would be best if he could avoid conflict with the other party. At the very least he wouldn't be wasting time. As for asking about the other party's identity, he just wanted to understand the other party's intentions. The God Emperor Realm Godly Beast was clearly not a scheming person. When it heard Ji Tianxing's words, it laughed heartily. "Ah, you foreign race brat, are you playing dumb with me? Do you think I will let you go just because you are so polite to me? You are too naive. The Pantheon of Immortality came out in full force and caused such a huge commotion in my territory. Do you think I am blind and don't exist? If I am not wrong, the Pantheon of Immortality spent so much effort and resources just to capture you. If you had settled this matter in the Pantheon of Immortality's territory, that would have been fine. But of all things, you shouldn't have barged into this emperor's territory. Do you want to bring the flames of war here and kill the people under this emperor's command? Don't even think about it. I will kill you today to prevent future troubles." The words of the orc overlord revealed its true thoughts, as well as what it had done before. Ji Tianxing understood immediately. The Pantheon of Immortality had caused such a huge commotion that the beast overlord had been paying attention to it and was prepared. Perhaps this beast overlord didn't know what had happened and what had caused it. However, this beast overlord had set up traps and ambushes in advance and was unwilling to stay out of the matter. He wanted to interfere. Ji Tianxing said that he was just passing by and had no intention of disturbing the other party. However, the other party still refused to give up. Since that was the case, there was nothing left to talk about. They could only fight to the death to decide the victor. Ji Tianxing frowned and stared at the beast overlord. He asked in a low voice, "Are you sure you want to interfere and add to the casualties? There is no enmity between us and these beast overlord soldiers are innocent. If you really want to fight with me, these experts will all die in a few rounds. Have you considered this? Furthermore, even if we fight to the end, you may not be able to defeat me. I hope you will think twice before you act. Don't make a mistake." As he spoke, Ji Tianxing released a divine aura that could suppress everything. The aura of a god emperor immediately spread out. Under the cover of this invisible divine aura, The elite Beast Overlord soldiers were filled with fear and worry. Even the Beast Overlord was wary of Ji Tianqing's aura and hesitated. Although Ji Tianqing's words were a threat, they were also the truth. If the Beast Overlord insisted on attacking him, not only would it not gain any benefits, it would also suffer heavy casualties. Originally, the Beast Overlord had thought of backing off and forcing Ji Tianqing to swear an oath. As long as he did not harass its people, it would allow him to pass through. However, the Beast Overlord had second thoughts. It had long known about this and had spent so much time and effort to set up this trap. Now that it had finally intercepted the other party, what would happen if the other party dismissed it with just a few words? Where would its dignity as a Beast Overlord be? Its strength and dignity as a God Emperor would no longer exist. Thus, after a moment of silence, the Beast Overlord shouted in a low voice, "Kid, I already knew that you foreign races have always been good at sweet-talking and bluffing. No matter what you say today, I will not let you leave. We will only know if this matter succeeds after we fight." After speaking, the Beast Overlord ordered the elite Beast Overlords. It roared in a dignified tone, "Attack! Beat them up for this Emperor. Let these bastards know how powerful you are. Since they dared to barge into my territory, they can forget about leaving unscathed." As its voice fell, more than 2,000 Beast Overlords roared in anger and released earth-shattering divine abilities and spells. They surrounded the god-slaying battleship. Chapter 4784. Ji Tianqing wasn't afraid of the Beast Race Lord in the first place. He just didn't want to waste time in a pointless fight and give the experts of the Pantheon of Immortality a chance to catch up. However, the Beast Race Lord was very confident. He didn't listen to advice and was a little overbearing. Since the two sides didn't have a chance to negotiate and the other side attacked first, Ji Tianqing wasn't going to show mercy. "You're courting death." Ji Tianqing roared angrily. Golden divine light burst out of his body and his aura reached its peak. He unleashed all of his power and swung the sword of burial of heaven. He slashed out hundreds of dazzling sword lights toward the crowd. Bang bang bang. Countless divine spells and sword shadows were shattered by the sword light that was thousands of feet long. Muffled noises could be heard. Most of the sword lights landed in the crowd and immediately cut the Divine King elite beasts into pieces. Blood and flesh splattered everywhere. Painful screams and shrill cries rang out, reverberating endlessly between the heavens and the earth. In just one exchange, over 100 God King realm beasts were killed by Ji Tianqing. As for their attacks, they were blocked by the divine light barrier after hitting the god-slaying battleship. The five-colored light barrier shook violently from the impact. Layers of ripples appeared on its surface, but it did not shatter. Bai Long controlled the god-slaying battleship and activated its divine cannons. 360 divine light beams were fired at the beast race experts on both sides. With a series of loud rumbling sounds, the more than 300 pillars of divine power exploded in the crowd, filling the sky with divine light and bits of flesh and blood. Over 100 unlucky god kings of the beast race were blasted into pieces by the god-slaying battleship. Not even their bones were left. There were dozens of beasts who were lucky enough to survive, but they were severely injured. Their divine bodies were incomplete and they looked especially miserable. The beast race lord saw that the other side was so strong. He immediately frowned and a cold light flashed through his eyes. "Damn bastard! You are courting death." The beast lord roared and waved his claws and fangs, unleashing a violent aura as he charged towards Ji Tianqing without regard for anything else. It had to make a move personally to stop Ji Tianqing. Otherwise, the several thousand divine king realm beasts under its command would not have been enough for Ji Tianqing and the god-slaying battleship. After the orc lord joined the battle, the situation changed. After all, it had the strength of a mid-level god emperor, so Ji Tianqing could only divert most of his attention to deal with it. For the time being, he had no time to slaughter the beast race god kings. As the two god emperors fought in the sky, they could only occasionally release a bit of their divine power. The shockwaves from their battle could easily harm dozens of beasts. White Dragon controlled the god-slaying battleship. Not only did he have to defend against the attacks of the many beasts, but he also had to fire the cannons to counterattack. Gradually he began to feel powerless. In theory, even if the god-slaying battleship was an emperor-level divine warship, it would not be able to withstand the combined attacks of several thousand god kings. Even if the god-slaying battleship counterattacked with all its might and could kill several hundred god kings, it was destined to be destroyed. White Dragon also understood this point. So while he was counterattacking with all his might, he did not forget to find an opportunity to break out of the encirclement. Furthermore, the hatch of the god-slaying battleship opened. 3 beams of divine light flashed and flew out of the battleship. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. The 3 figures that appeared in the sky were 3 peerless beauties. They each had their own merits, but they were all top-notch beauties in the world. Moreover, they were all god emperors. They were the Pan-Ruo god emperor Yunyao and Jiku. They all held divine weapons and were enveloped in divine light shields. Their killing intent soared to the sky. Without any nonsense, they directly joined the battle. They waved their divine weapons and began to slaughter the beast race god kings. Swish, swish, swish. The Pan-Ruo god emperor waved her divine sword and instantly shot out hundreds of sword lights. They rained down like a rain of arrows and landed on the crowd in the west. Jiku flew high into the sky and waved her divine spear. Nirvana flames covered the sky and covered the sun. Like a torrential flood, they rained down on the crowd in the east. Yunyao waved her 2 swords and slashed out hundreds of crescent-shaped sword lights. They charged into the crowd in the north. Instantly, more than 3,000 beast race god kings were swallowed by the sword lights. In the raging sea of flames, they let out heart-wrenching screams and wails. Among the 3 beauties, the Pan-Ruo god emperor was the strongest. Her killing power was also the most terrifying. She only used 1 move to kill more than 100 beast race god kings. As for Yunyao and Jiku, although they were only at the god emperor initial stage and had only condensed 1 Dao rhyme, it was more than enough to deal with these beast race god kings. The 2 of them used their mystic arts and secret techniques. In the blink of an eye, they killed dozens of beast race god kings and injured dozens more. The power of the 3,000 beast race god kings was divided. They had to surround the god-slaying battleship and deal with Yunyao and Pan-Ruo. The pressure on the god-slaying battleship was greatly reduced. Bai Long was also able to divert more energy to continue firing the cannons to kill the beast race. Following a series of loud rumbling noises, the 2 sides launched a fierce battle. In just 100 breaths of time, the 2 sides exchanged dozens of blows. The battle was one-sided. Almost half of the 3,000 beast race god kings were killed. There were still 1,800 left. They were still fighting a bloody battle and refused to retreat. The god-slaying battleship was unscathed. It was still protected by the divine light barrier. Bai Long was still controlling the god-slaying battleship to attack. Pan-Ruo, Yunyao and Pan-Ruo were also unscathed. Their divine power was still abundant. They continuously unleashed destructive mystic arts and mystic arts. The mountains and rivers within a radius of 20,000 miles were swept away by the divine power shockwaves. Countless forests and mountains were destroyed. They were turned into ruins. Many deep pits and wide ravines were left on the ground. Dust filled the air and fragments of divine light sprinkled down. The 1,000 beast race god kings were terrified. Their hearts were filled with fear. They all had the thought of running away. As for Zhi Tianxing and the beast race leader who were fighting high up in the sky, the victor had already been decided. Both of them were in the middle stage of the God Emperor stage. They had condensed 5 Taoist rhymes. Logically speaking, they should be evenly matched. However, that was not the case. From the beginning, the beast race leader was suppressed by Zhi Tianxing. After exchanging 2 blows, it was forced to retreat. After exchanging 3 blows, it was injured. Now the 2 sides had already exchanged more than 60 blows. The battlefield had shifted close to 50,000 miles. Countless ravines and ruins were left behind along the way. Zhi Tianxing was unscathed. He was calm and composed. There was not a single wound on his body. The mountain-sized beast overlord was covered in hideous wounds. Blood kept flowing out of the wounds, making it look like a bloody mess. One of its legs had been severed. There was also a huge wound on its back. One could clearly see the divine bones inside. Furthermore, its right eye had been pierced through by the sword of burial of heaven. Only a hole was left. After suffering such heavy injuries, the beast race leader's strength fell drastically. He was extremely terrified. He could only turn around and run. However, how could Zhi Tianxing let it go so easily? He naturally pursued it. Chapter 4785. The beast tribe leader fled with all its might into the depths of the unknown lands. While fleeing, it did not forget to contact the other beast tribe leaders and ask for their help. Back then, it had discovered that there were strange movements in the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality, so it had secretly sent its elite beast tribe members to investigate the situation. After its investigation, it did not inform the other beast tribe leaders and set up traps and ambushes on its own. No matter what benefits there were, it could take them all for itself. However, it now regretted not informing the other beast tribe leaders. If it had cooperated with the other beast tribe leaders, wouldn't it have been a piece of cake to deal with Zhi Tianxing? Heavenly Dragon / Sword piercing the 9 heavens. Zhi Tianxing pursued the beast tribe leader relentlessly. Every time the distance between them closed to over 10,000 kilometers, he would use a divine ability. The beast tribe leader was in great pain. Its injuries were worsening and its strength was weakening. Its speed became slower and slower and it could no longer shake Zhi Tianxing off its tail. 15 minutes later it was stopped by Zhi Tianxing. In the air above a majestic mountain range, the two of them engaged in an intense battle. Although the battle was intense, the two of them were not evenly matched. Instead it was a one-sided battle. Zhi Tianxing only used 3 moves to destroy the Orc Overlord's divine body, smashing it into pieces and turning it into a pile of flesh and blood. The beast tribe leader only had 1 divinity left. It was also injured and its surface was full of cracks. Even so, it did not give up on escaping. Its divinity released a dazzling divine flame as it fled into the distance. As long as it could escape, it did not care if it had to use a divine ability or consume its own strength and lifespan. Zhi Tianxing hurriedly used teleportation to chase after it. In just a few breaths' time he had stopped it again. He then swung the sword of burial of heaven and slashed out a few heaven-splitting sword projections, which struck the beast tribe leader's divinity. Following a crisp cracking sound, the beast tribe leader's divinity was shattered on the spot, turning into over 20 divinity fragments. Just like that, the beast overlord lost its life. Before it died, it was filled with regret and unwillingness. He hated himself for meddling in other people's business. He should not have investigated the Pantheon of Immortality. It hated itself for being greedy and selfish. After discovering the situation, it did not cooperate with the lords and chose to act alone. If that wasn't the case, how could it have ended up like this? However, all these regrets and unwillingness were meaningless. You only have 1 life. If you lose it, you can't get it back. The muffled sound that reverberated between heaven and earth gradually dissipated, and the divine light that filled the sky also gradually disappeared. The battle was over. Zhi Tianxing waved his hand and caught the quintessence fragments that were falling from the sky. He put them into his spatial ring. This beast overlord had neither an emperor-level divine weapon nor a battleship. Apart from the godhead fragment, it could be said that he had nothing else on him. Therefore, after the battle ended, Zhi Tianxing did not need to clean up the battlefield and turned to leave. He went back the way he came to find the god-slaying battleship Yunyao Jiku and the others. Although he was confident in Pan Ruo Yunyao and Jiku's strength, there were too many beast god kings. He was still worried about the 3 women's safety. As the saying went, many ants could kill an elephant. With a few thousand beast god kings surrounding the god-slaying battleship and the 3 god kings, there was still hope for them to win. However, reality proved that Zhi Tianxing's worries were unnecessary. He had only flown 100,000 miles when he saw a divine light flying over from the south. There was a divine battleship in that divine light. It was the god-slaying battleship. Seeing that the god-slaying battleship's divine light barrier was still there, and that the battleship's surface was intact without any signs of damage, Zhi Tianxing finally calmed down. Swoosh! In the blink of an eye, the god-slaying battleship flew closer and stopped in the sky. Zhi Tianxing's figure flashed and he entered the god-slaying battleship and returned to the cockpit. Bai Long steered the god-slaying battleship and activated the aura concealing array formation before continuing to fly north. Zhi Tianxing opened his mouth and asked, "The battle is over? How are the results? Are they all safe?" Bai Long steered the battleship as he replied, "We are all unharmed and the battleship is also safe and sound. Only the barrier was breached once, but it's nothing serious. Of the 3,800 beast god kings, we killed more than 2,300 of them." When the remaining 1,500 beast god kings saw that their beast overlord was injured and fled, their morale plummeted and they were quickly defeated. Master's wives only chased after more than 100 beast god kings, and they stopped chasing. They also did not want to waste time to prevent us from being in more danger, so they returned to the divine battleship and entered the divine pagoda to rest. Ji Tianxing nodded in satisfaction at this outcome. He said, "It's great that everyone is safe and sound. The incident just now was just a small interlude and it did not cause any harm to us. However, it delayed us for some time and it also left behind obvious traces." When the experts of the Pantheon of Immortality and the Taiyu Shrine caught up and saw the ruins that spanned tens of thousands of miles, they understood everything. Therefore, do not continue flying north in a straight line. Quickly adjust your direction and change your escape route. Next, try to conceal your aura as much as possible and keep a low profile. Do not encounter any beast overlords and it should not be a big problem. After hearing his master's advice, Bai Long hurriedly nodded to show that he understood. "Master, don't worry, I know what to do. You can rest in peace." Ji Tianxing did not say anything else. He let Bai Long steer the battleship and returned to the Nine Heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda. After entering the distorted spacetime, he first circled around the blood flame sacred tree to check on everyone's situation. Seeing that Pan Ruo Yunyao and Ji Ku were unharmed and were already cultivating, he did not disturb them. On the other side, Bai Feng, Ji Wuhan, and the others had been cultivating in seclusion. Now they were at the critical moment of their breakthrough. Ji Tianxing observed for a while and saw that Bai Feng had encountered difficulties during her breakthrough. It seemed that she had not been able to solve it for a long time, so he helped. He mobilized his divine power and slowly and gently transferred it to Bai Feng. He also mixed in a trace of Taoist rhyme and his understanding and comprehension of the divine Tao law. Bai Feng, who had been stuck at a bottleneck, received the vast and mighty divine power, as well as the mysterious Taoist rhyme and cultivation experience. Instantly, her body shook slightly and her tightly knitted brows relaxed. It was very obvious that Ji Tianxing had helped her and given her what she wanted and needed the most. Next, if she continued to cultivate, she would have an 80% chance of successfully breaking through. As for Ji Wuhan, Ji Tianxing observed for a while and found that his son's talent was extraordinary, and his comprehension was extremely strong. He had not encountered any real problems or shackles. For others, problems that could shackle them for life were often quickly comprehended and solved by Ji Wuhan. This made Ji Tianxing feel very gratified. He no longer worried about his children's cultivation. He returned to his personal spot under the sacred tree and started to cultivate and refine the Beast Overlord's divine spark fragment. Previously, he had already mastered 2,700 types of divine Tao law, and he was not far from gathering 3,000 great Taos. This Beast Overlord's divine spark fragment would definitely allow him to improve further. Chapter 4786. Other than the unlucky leader that was killed by Ji Tianxing, there were 5 other leaders in this unknown land. Their lifespans and cultivation realms were about the same. They were all divine beasts that were born in ancient times and had the strength of a mid-level god emperor. The strongest one had condensed 6 Taoist rhymes, while the weakest one had condensed 5 Taoist rhymes. Back in the realm of the gods, the Black Dragon and Qianyu that were with Ji Tianxing could be considered top-notch divine beast. However, in the planet of origin, they were only considered juniors compared to these god emperor level divine beast. The 5 leaders usually stayed in their own territories and enjoyed the cultivation resources that their people gave them. They cultivated day and night. They had lived for nearly 100,000 years and had done everything that they wanted to do in their lives. Now their lives had returned to their natural state and were no longer interesting. What kept them alive and continued to train hard was not power or wealth, but immortality. Unfortunately, although there was no major conflict or hatred between the leaders of the beast clans, they had never formed an alliance. Moreover, they did not have the corresponding wisdom and means to explore the mystery of immortality. They only heard bits and pieces of information from the powerhouses of the various temples that were related to immortality. It was precisely because of this that the unlucky overlord from before had found out about the movements of the Temple of Indestructible, and had mobilized a large force to set up an ambush, vainly attempting to kill Ji Tianxing alone. Before he died, he was filled with remorse. In order to get the leaders to avenge him, he told them the secret of immortality. He told the leaders in a jade slip that the pantheon of immortality and the powerhouses of the Taiyu shrine were chasing after a young man from a foreign race. That guy was a mid-level god emperor and was also the chosen one of the temples. He was the one who could solve the mystery of immortality. Unfortunately, he was no match for that guy and was severely injured. He probably could not escape. If the leaders were interested, they could help him kill the chosen one and avenge him. He would also comfort his spirit. If it was possible, the unlucky lord wanted to say more to convince the other lords to help him take revenge. However, time did not allow for it, and it had to send messages to several lords, so it could only make it short. Before it died, it thought that the words "the chosen one" and "the mystery of eternal life" should be enough to move the suzerains, right? In fact, when the 5 suzerains received the message, they were all shocked and in disbelief. They would never have thought that an uninvited guest would intrude into the unknown land that had been peaceful for countless years. Furthermore, the uninvited guest from the other race was called the Heaven's Chosen One, and was being pursued by the experts of the 2 great temples. No matter how he looked at it, this news was too ridiculous to be true. The lords were all wondering if that guy was bored and made up a lie to tease them. However, after the lords calmed down and thought about it for a while, they felt that it was not impossible. That guy wasn't such a senseless person. He wouldn't make up such nonsense. Thus, they sent out messages one after another, contacting the unlucky feudal lord and asking about its current situation. The result was obvious. The unlucky feudal lord did not reply to their messages at all. Only then did the lords realize the seriousness of the matter. They became more and more convinced that something might have happened to that unlucky guy. They could not contact that feudal lord, so they sent out messages one after another, probing and asking each other if they had received the news. After some probing and verification, the lords were sure that they had all received the news. Thus, they began to communicate and discuss the authenticity of the news. After some serious discussion, the lords unanimously agreed that something might have happened to that unlucky guy. Thus, the 3 lords who were closer to him immediately said that they would gather their troops and rush over to check out the situation. Although they were only 60 to 70% sure that what the unlucky feudal lord said was true, they did not dare to fully believe the news. However, this was related to the mystery of eternal life. As long as there was a glimmer of hope, they did not want to miss it. They all wanted to take a gamble. The 3 overlords quickly set off with thousands of beast race god kings. The 2 overlords who were further away were also rather anxious. They also wanted to check out the situation, but they were too far away. It would be too late by the time they arrived. But the other 3 lords had already taken action. They could not be delayed and had to prepare in advance. Thus, they began to gather the Beast Clan God Kings under their command, ready to move out at a moment's notice. They also kept in contact with the other 3 lords and warned them that if they encountered any danger, they would definitely send reinforcements. An hour had passed since Zhou Xian killed that unlucky feudal lord. The god-slaying warship had long since adjusted its direction and changed its route. It sped north and had already flown several million li. At this moment, the immortal god emperor's warship passed through the unknown lands and just so happened to pass by the ruins. The ruins spanning tens of thousands of li were particularly striking in the midst of the lofty mountains and precipitous ridges. The mountains and forests had been shattered and collapsed. All that was left of the ground was a massive crater and a ravine that extended into the distance. The world was silent. The dust in the air had long since dispersed, but the god kings and god emperor experts could still sense the remnants of divine power in the world. It was extremely dense, extremely mixed and chaotic. When the immortal god emperor's warship passed by, it stopped above the ruins and carefully observed them for a while. The immortal god emperor even used a secret art to investigate the origins of these ruins and analyze the remnant divine power in the world. After 10 odd breaths of time, he raised an eyebrow and revealed a joyful expression. His spirits were roused. Yes, it's him. There's a trace of his divine power here. He fought a great battle with another god emperor here. The Heaven's Chosen One that he wanted to kill had fought with a powerhouse here an hour ago. This meant that he wasn't far from the Heaven's Chosen. If he worked a little harder, he would have a chance of catching up. However, the immortal god emperor was puzzled and he thought to himself, this is only the border of the unknown lands. Who would set up an ambush here to kill him? Could it be someone from the Taiyu shrine? That old bastard Taiyu God Emperor must have predicted that the Kenshin would be able to get past our defenses and enter the unknown lands. Is that why he set up an ambush here? This was the immortal God Emperor's first thought, but he immediately dismissed it. That's not right. If the Taiyu God Emperor set up an ambush here, he would have had several temple lords with him. With their strength and methods, they would have been able to capture Kenshin. Moreover, the corpses scattered around the ruins don't look like they belonged to the desolate race's god kings, but the beast races. In that case, which beast overlord led the beast race god kings under his command to ambush Sword God here? After some speculation and analysis, the immortal God Emperor determined that the beast race overlord was the one behind this ambush. Chapter 4787. This was the unknown lands, so it wasn't strange for a beast overlord and a large group of beast god kings to appear here. However, the immortal God Emperor thought further. He felt that there was an even more serious danger behind this problem. He continued to analyze and ponder this problem as he steered the warship northward. This is the border of the unknown lands. The overlord that rules this area should live 200 to 300 million kilometers to the north. Under normal circumstances he wouldn't come here, nor would he station his troops here. It's most likely that he sent out scouts to gather information in my territory. After all, everyone in the world knows that I've mobilized so many people and caused so much panic. That beast overlord probably heard about Kenshin and the Chosen One, and was interested in the mystery of eternal life. That's why he led so many beast god kings to set up an ambush here. The savage beasts in this barren land wanted to live forever, and even wanted to bring people here to kill the Heaven's Chosen One? What wishful thinking. The immortal God Emperor responded to the beast overlord's thoughts and actions with a sneer and disdain. However, he couldn't help but think of an even more important problem. With that beast overlord's strength, there's no way he can keep Kenshin here, and it'll be very difficult for him to defeat Kenshin. There are 5 or 6 overlords in this unknown lands. Apart from that guy, have the other overlords received any information? The beast race had always moved in groups and would never fight alone. In that case, that guy must have notified the other overlords. Damn it. It's already troublesome enough that the people of the Cosmos Temple are causing trouble, and now a few beastmen want to interfere? The beast overlord was furious at this point, but he was also filled with worry. Originally, he was confident that he could capture Kenshin and monopolize the mystery of eternal life. However, the Taiyu God Emperor's interference gave him a headache, and he couldn't start a war with the Taiyu Shrine. Now that a few more beast overlords had appeared, the situation would only become more chaotic, and his chances of capturing Kenshin would be even lower. Thus, on his way north, he sent several messages to the other temple lords, urging them to follow him as quickly as possible. At the same time, he didn't forget to ask the soldiers guarding the defensive line if they'd discovered any traces of the experts from the Taiyu Shrine. He had to confirm where the Taiyu God Emperor and the other temple lords were and how much of a threat they could pose to him. On the surface, this unknown place could be considered to be peaceful, and there were no signs of unrest. But in reality, the undercurrent was already surging. All the forces were actively preparing for war and even taking action. The god-slaying battleship became the target of the various factions. It was like a small boat drifting in the treacherous sea of the unknown. Bai Long drove the warship and was extremely cautious. He did not dare to be careless. 8 days passed by. Tianxia had been cultivating in seclusion in the distorted spacetime. He had long refined the quintessence fragment of that unlucky overlord. Not only God Emperor's godses but God's God Gatibai now, he had grasped over 2,750 God laws. His strength had increased imperceptibly, and he was one step closer to reaching 3,000 perfected great Taos. This also laid a foundation for him to condense his next Tao rhyme. In addition, he had also refined the God Emperor's soul memories. Not to uncover any secrets, but to understand the situation in this unknown lands. Through the God Emperor's soul memories, Tianxia learned just how vast this unknown lands was and how many overlords there were. More importantly, he knew that the God Emperor had sent a message to the other 5 beast overlords before his death. This matter gave Tianxia a headache and made him feel worried. I didn't expect that the beast overlords of this unknown lands would also know about the secret of the heavenly Tao and that the 4 holy temples are searching for the Chosen One. This god emperor sure is bold. After hearing about what happened to the Pantheon of Immortality, he dared to lead a group of beast overlords to ambush me. Fortunately, he was selfish and greedy. He wanted to take the mystery of immortality for himself, so he didn't join forces with the other overlords. If he was more cautious and found the other beast overlords to work with, I would be dead by now. After finishing his cultivation, Ji Tianxing sat under the blood flame sacred tree and silently analyzed the situation. Now that this god emperor is dead, he spread the news before his death. From his soul memories, the 5 beast overlords are not to be trifled with. They are all ambitious and powerful god emperor powerhouses. There is an 80% chance that they will be interested in the mystery of immortality. Even if they don't want to avenge their overlord, they will still gather their troops to kill me. First it was the Taiyu Shrine. Then it was the Pantheon of Immortality. Now there are a few beast overlords. All 3 forces are hunting me down. I thought that after killing the 4 god emperors, I would have avenged my death and could take root in the planet of origin in peace. I didn't expect that I would offend the 4 holy temples and attract so many powerhouses to hunt me down. The identity of the Chosen One is really a public enemy. A few years ago, Ji Tianxing followed the temple masters of the Xianxia temple to the depths of the Chaos Sea and saw the door of Heavenly Tao. At that time, although he did not personally touch the door of Heavenly Tao, he could sense something strange. He was almost certain that he was the Chosen One mentioned by the 4 holy temples. However, he did not know the use of the Chosen One, how to open the door of Heavenly Tao, and what would happen after opening the door of Heavenly Tao. Therefore he did not take the risk and try rashly. He had always planned to explore the door of Heavenly Tao when he was strong enough after taking revenge. However, he did not expect that the situation would develop to this point. His situation was becoming more and more difficult and dangerous. At this moment he had a very strong idea and thought. That was, to return to the Chaos Sea as soon as possible, return to the door of Heavenly Tao and open it with his own hands. He wanted to see what benefits the identity of the Chosen One could bring him. After the door of Heavenly Tao was opened, would there be any miracles or shocking things? After a long time, Ji Tianxing ended his deductions and guesses. He calmed down and continued to cultivate. Although I've confirmed my next goal and plan, it's useless for me to let my imagination run wild. The most important thing now is to continue to improve my strength and become more powerful. If I were to fight the immortal God Emperor, I might be able to remain undefeated, or I might escape with light injuries. However, I still have no chance of winning against the Taiyu God Emperor. I have to condense the 6th Taoist rhyme as soon as possible, or even reach the upper level of the God Emperor. Only then can I stand firm on the planet of origin and not be afraid of the 4 holy temples, and establish my own force. With this thought in mind, Ji Tianxing went into seclusion again to study the heaven-punishing divine technique and deduce the next level of the technique. Chapter 4788. In the blink of an eye, another 5 days had passed. The god-slaying warship was still hurrying through the unknown lands. It remained invisible, its aura restrained as it flew through the air. The immortal God Emperor's warship was also in hot pursuit. In order to avoid being surrounded by the beast race, the warship had also concealed its tracks and aura, but it did not slow down much. However, the path taken by the immortal God Emperor was somewhat different from the path taken by Ji Tianxing. Not only was there a gap of 3 million li, there was also a deviation of more than 1 million li unless some accident or miracle occurred. The immortal God Emperor would never be able to catch up to Ji Tianxing. But the affairs of the world were unpredictable and the outcome was difficult to predict. On this morning, the god-slaying warship was flying over a lofty mountain range when a dazzling divine light suddenly erupted from the summit of a massive mountain. Several massive sword glows slashed at the god-slaying warship. The sudden ambush and attack made White Dragon frown fiercely. A cold light flashed in his eyes. Subconsciously, he thought that it was a formation and ambush set up by the sect master of one of the divine palaces on the mountain peak. But when he thought about it, he realized that the Pantheon of Immortality and the temple lords of the Taiyu Shrine were still chasing after them. They couldn't have caught up so quickly, and yet they had managed to get ahead of them and set up an ambush. This was far too frightening and unbelievable. There was only one answer. The only ones who could set up an ambush in front of them were probably the beast race lords of this unknown land. And those beast race lords might have the strength of a god emperor, but they might not be skilled in setting up formations. Even if they did, their strength would be limited. Of course, the god-slaying warship was invisible and had even concealed its aura, but it had still been discovered. This was proof that the enemy was no pushover. Although it was a long story, these thoughts flashed through White Dragon's mind in the blink of an eye. He made a decision on the spot. He steered the god-slaying warship into a barrier of divine light while also moving to the right to avoid those sword glows. But the result was still within White Dragon's expectations. Those sword glows had locked onto the god-slaying warship's aura, so how could they miss? Ping ping ping. The 4 sword lights slashed the divine light shield of the god-slaying battleship, creating a loud, muffled sound. Fragments of divine light splashed all over the sky, and rings of 5-colored shockwaves spread out like ripples. The 4 streaks of sword radiance all collapsed, turning into fragments that scattered across the sky. The divine light barrier of the divine slaughtering battleship was also destroyed, breaking into pieces and scattering out countless fragments. The powerful impact forced the god-slaying battleship back dozens of miles. Bai Long activated several formations and spent a lot of effort to stabilize the god-slaying battleship in the sky. After that, Bai Long did not bother to find out what kind of formations and traps were on that mountain peak, nor how many beast race elites and experts were lying in ambush there. He directly steered the god-slaying battleship toward the northeast. He had no time to hide the traces and aura of the battleship. He just sped up and ran away like a shooting star. Swish. In the blink of an eye, the god-slaying battleship charged out 40,000 miles. But that mountain peak lit up with divine light again. A divine bird that was as big as a mountain spread its wings and soared into the sky. It let out a crisp cry and like lightning, it streaked across the sky and headed straight for the god-slaying battleship. At the same time, the formation on the mountain peak also revealed itself. It lit up with divine light and released thousands of sword lights that rained down on the god-slaying battleship. There were also thousands of beast race god kings who removed their disguises and flew into the sky from the mountain peak. They charged toward the god-slaying battleship with murderous intent. Their plan was very clear. They would let that god emperor divine bird pin down the god-slaying battleship, and then let the thousands of beast race elite god kings surround the battleship. This way they would definitely succeed. Bai Long also realized this. He knew that the divine bird had the power of a god emperor. He knew that he could not deal with it, so he hurriedly reported to his master. Ji Tianxing was cultivating in seclusion in the distorted spacetime to condense his 6th Dao rhyme. Currently, he had already condensed a trace of it. If he continued cultivating in seclusion for another 100 or 200 years, he would have a chance of condensing his 6th Dao rhyme. At such an important juncture of cultivation, Ji Tianxing did not want to be disturbed if it was any ordinary matter. But Bai Long's report was urgent, so he could only end his seclusion and leave the distorted spacetime. Swish. With a flash of white light, Ji Tianxing appeared in the cockpit of the god-slaying battleship, standing behind Bai Long. There was no need for Bai Long to report the situation. Ji Tianxing scanned with his divine sense and saw the situation clearly. 30,000 miles behind the battleship, that divine bird spread its wings and charged over like an arrow. It opened its sharp beak and shot out dozens of flaming light pillars that locked onto the god-slaying battleship. More than 40,000 miles behind, thousands of elite god kings roared and charged over, wanting to besiege the god-slaying battleship. Ji Tianxing knew at a glance that they had been ambushed by a beast overlord. Although he had already guessed that a few beast overlords would rush over after hearing the news, he was still surprised. What kind of method did the other party use to be able to predict his path? Not only did they ambush him with thousands of beast overlords, but they also set up an inescapable net in advance. Seeing that the divine bird had already caught up, and the dozens of flaming light pillars with the power to incinerate everything were about to hit the god-slaying battleship, Ji Tianxing did not have time to think about any more questions. He could only fly out of the god-slaying battleship and take out the sword of burial of heaven to face that divine bird head-on. Sword shattering 9 heavens. Ji Tianxing roared as his left hand formed a hand seal, and his right hand slashed out a huge divine sword that could split heaven and earth. The dark golden sword light that was 10,000 feet long had the power to split heaven and earth. The invincible sword intent slashed at the flaming light pillars with a deafening boom. Bam! Bam, bam. Those divine flame light pillars were shattered on the spot, bursting with flames that filled the sky, turning into a sea of fire. However, the huge dark golden sword did not dissipate. Instead, it was still full of power as it slashed viciously toward the divine bird. When the divine bird saw Ji Tianqing appear, its eyes lit up on the spot, flickering with a dazzling light. Its mood also became excited and excited. It was one of the beast overlords that had received the news, and it was here for the chosen one. It immediately realized that this young foreign god emperor was its target the moment it saw Ji Tianqing. Even though the two of them had not yet clashed, it could sense just how powerful its opponent was just from the power of that sword strike. It couldn't help but think to itself, no wonder that unlucky guy was killed. This Kenshin really is extraordinary. It stared intently at the divine sword light, and it knew that it would not be able to dodge or evade. Thus, divine light erupted from its body as it materialized into a huge shield and charged toward the sword light. Boom! The divine bird used its sharp beak to crash viciously into the divine sword light, and an earth-shattering boom erupted as the sword light was pulverized. Chapter 4789. Although the divine bird collided head-on with the sword light and smashed it into pieces, it was not injured. Its sharp beak was its most important weapon. It was much stronger and tougher than ordinary emperor-level divine artifacts. It was not any weaker than the sword of burial of heaven. After destroying the sword light, its sharp beak was not damaged at all. It was still shining with a dazzling divine light. Although Ji Tianqing had neutralized Yong Qianlord's attack, he was still surprised. He stared at Yong Qianlord's sharp beak for a while and discovered the problem. He knew that it was his opponent's strongest weapon. Therefore, he avoided it and looked for his opponent's weakness. At the same time, the god-slaying battleship was out of danger. It wasn't that Bai Long wanted to run away and abandon his master. Instead, Ji Tianqing had instructed him to ignore the beast race experts and just focus on running away as fast as he could. As for Ji Tianqing, he would stop Yong Qianlord and the thousands of beast race god kings to prevent them from threatening the god-slaying battleship. If he could kill Yong Qianlord, it would be for the best. If he could not kill Yong Qianlord, he would not stay here for too long. He would find a chance to escape. With his strength and methods, as long as he wanted to leave, Yong Qianlord and the beast race god kings would not be able to stop him. Bai Long believed in his master's strength. He could definitely do that. Even if the beast race god kings were outnumbered, his master could come and go as he pleased. The god-slaying battleship would only be a burden and distract his master. Both master and Bai Long trusted each other. That was why they could work together. In just a few breaths' time, the god-slaying battleship was like a shooting star. It flew out 100,000 miles and left the battlefield. Only Yong Qianlord and Ji Tianqing were left. They were fighting fiercely in the sky. The thousands of beast race god kings took the opportunity to surround Ji Tianqing. They joined forces to form a battle formation and attacked Ji Tianqing from all sides, using all kinds of divine abilities and consummate skills. However, with their strength and methods, it was very difficult for them to cause any real harm to Ji Tianqing. However, they could pressure Ji Tianqing and limit Ji Tianqing's strength, creating opportunities for Yong Qianlord. The two sides fought fiercely in the sky. It was difficult to tell who had the upper hand. Rumble. Loud noises kept coming out, reverberating between heaven and earth. Dazzling divine arts clashed in the sky. Fragments of divine light covered the sky and scattered on the ground. The earth, mountains, and forests within a radius of 30,000 miles were all destroyed by the aftermath of the battle, turning into ruins and desolation. Although Ji Tianqing was attacking Yong Qianlord, Yong Qianlord, Yong Qianlord, Yong Qianlord, Yong Qianlord, and Yong Qianlord, the encirclement of several thousand beast race god kings could only cause him some trouble. He had to divert a portion of his attention to dodge and defend. Yong Qianlord could even ignore most of the attacks with his emperor-level divine armor. He did not even take the god-slaying divine kings seriously. The two sides fought in the sky for about 15 minutes. Ji Tianqing and Yong Qianlord had exchanged more than 800 blows. In the end, Ji Tianqing suffered some light injuries under the attacks of Yong Qianlord and thousands of god-slaying divine kings. He had paid a small price for it. However, Yong Qianlord suffered a terrible fate. Not only was he severely injured by Ji Tianqing, but his body was also severely injured. One of his wings was chopped off and his body was covered in blood. His strength dropped drastically and his body was covered in wounds. He was on the verge of collapsing. Even with the help of thousands of elite god-slaying divine kings, he did not dare to fight Ji Tianqing anymore. He quickly turned around and fled. It was only now that he was sure that the unlucky god-slaying divine lord was dead. After all, he was slightly stronger than the unlucky god-slaying divine lord. However, he was still severely injured and his life was in danger. From this, it could be seen that this heaven's chosen one's strength and methods were truly powerful. It was impossible for any of the god-slaying divine lords to defeat or capture him alone. Zhou Xian Lord tried his best to escape, but Ji Tianqing did not give up. He chased after him for another tens of thousands of miles. Seeing the thousands of god-slaying divine kings chasing after him and Zhou Xian Lord trying to escape, Ji Tianqing knew that he would have to delay the chase for a while longer if he did not use some of his trump cards. Since that was the case, Zhou Xian decided to use his full strength. He used the Sword of Annihilation and locked onto Zhou Xian Lord. Shua. In the next moment, a giant golden sword that was tens of thousands of feet long appeared. With the power to destroy everything, it descended from the sky and slashed towards Zhou Xian Lord. Golden light flashed as the sword qi filled the sky. It was as if the sun was hanging in the sky. The terrifying sword intent locked onto Zhou Xian Lord, causing his expression to change drastically. His eyes were filled with fear. Previously, he had taken Ji Tianqing seriously and treated Ji Tianqing with caution. He had also seen Ji Tianqing's strength and means. However, he did not expect that this was Ji Tianqing's true strength. He still had such a trump card. The soul-stirring sword intent made Lord Yong Chu realize that if the sword came down he would be dead. Not only would his body be destroyed, but his godly essence would also be destroyed. Thinking of this, Zhou Xian Lord's heart was filled with anxiety. Various thoughts flashed through his mind as he tried to think of a way to dodge the sword. Although he tried his best to dodging left and right and even using his teleportation ability, the sword was still locked onto him. However, the giant sword was locked onto it, so it was useless no matter how far it tried to run. In the end, Zhou Xian Lord gave up on dodging and chose the last option. That was to fight head-on. Swoosh. He unleashed all his power and condensed a divine light shield to protect himself. At the same time, it turned around with great difficulty. Holding the belief that it was facing death with equanimity, it stuck out its sharp mouth and collided head-on with the sword light. His sharp mouth was the hardest part of his body and it was also his main weapon. Since he wanted to block the attack of the divine sword, it was most practical to use his sharp mouth to defeat the sword qi. Boom. In the next moment, the Armageddon sword slashed Zhou Xian Lord's sharp mouth, causing a deafening sound. Golden light burst forth in the sky as flames rose in all directions. Violent shockwaves spread out like ripples in all directions. Lord Zhou Xian had thought that it would be able to survive at the cost of being severely injured or even having its body destroyed. However, it turned out that he had underestimated Ji Tianqing's strength and means. The Sword of Annihilation with its terrifying power instantly shattered its mouth and split its body into two halves. The violent sword qi tore his broken body into pieces, turning it into countless pieces of flesh and blood that scattered between heaven and earth. As for the godly essence in his head, it was also shattered by the Armageddon sword, turning into dozens of godly essence fragments that scattered on the ground. Chapter 4790. For the past tens of thousands of years, Zhou Xian Overlord had been staying in his territory and cultivating in seclusion in pursuit of a higher realm. Normally, he was one of the more ordinary overlords of the beast race. He was not high profile, did not cause trouble, and was not the most shrewd. However, like the other overlords of the beast race, he had a deep obsession and pursuit of immortality. In addition, his territory was very close to the unlucky overlord and he was the first to arrive. Therefore, he had used all kinds of methods to finally intercept Ji Tianqing. However, his cultivation was not enough and he was killed by the sword of the burial of heaven. Originally, the several thousand beast race god kings were still chasing after Ji Tianqing with murderous intent, vowing to capture him. After witnessing Zhou Xian Overlord being killed by Ji Tianqing, the thousands of beast race godly kings were all dumbfounded. They were all shocked and terrified. They never thought that their powerful overlord would be killed by the foreign race's god emperor just like that. The sudden blow stunned them for a moment. The confidence and morale in their hearts suffered a devastating blow. When they came back to their senses, there was no need for anyone to give them an order. All of them turned around and fled in the opposite direction. Even their overlord was killed. What could they who were only god kings do? There was absolutely no way to reverse the situation and change the situation of the battle. It was even more impossible to avenge the lord. All they could do was run away and save their lives. Swoosh, swoosh. The thousands of beast race god kings scattered like birds. In order to save their lives, they ran in different directions. As such, even if Zhi Tianxing wanted to kill them, he would not be able to kill them all. There would definitely be some that escaped. In fact, Zhi Tianxing did not plan to kill them. After picking up Zhou Xian Overlord's quintessence shard, he quickly left. His original goal was to stop Zhou Xian Overlord and let the god-slaying battleship escape. If Zhou Xian Overlord was difficult to deal with, he would also find an opportunity to escape and chase after the god-slaying battleship. He did not plan to kill Zhou Xian Overlord. However, Zhou Xian Overlord was not strong enough. After fighting for 15 minutes, he was severely injured and showed signs of defeat. That was why he suddenly had the idea of killing Lord Zhou Xian. After all, he was at a critical juncture in his cultivation. He needed the God Emperor's quintessence shard to gather the 3,000 great Tao and increase his strength quickly. Zhou Xian Overlord had the strength of a God Emperor and had condensed 5 Taoist rhymes. He was the perfect candidate. For this reason, Zhi Tianxing decided to kill Lord Zhou Xian first before leaving. It had to be said that the overlord of the beast tribe that Zhi Tianxing had killed, whose name was unknown, was already unlucky enough. Who would have thought that Lord Zhou Xian would not fare any better? He was just as unlucky. Of the beast race god kings, the beast race and god emperor, Zhi Tianxing also left the battlefield and flew north as fast as lightning. After flying north for hundreds of thousands of miles, he caught up with the god-slaying battleship. The white dragon followed his instructions. After leaving the battlefield, it flew at a leisurely pace while ensuring its own safety. After Zhi Tianxing returned to the battleship, the white dragon controlled the battleship's array and continued to speed up. That was the end of the episode. Zhou Xian Overlord was dead. The beast race god kings under his command did not have the ability to avenge him. As for Zhi Tianxing, he had already left on the god-slaying battleship. He did not leave any traces behind. Only the ruins that were tens of thousands of kilometers wide still remained on that battlefield, silently telling the story of how tragic the battle had been at that time. If there were no accidents, only the beast race under Zhou Xian Overlord and the surrounding beast race experts would be lucky enough to see the ruins. However, accidents still happened. Of course, it was not an accident. It was inevitable. The immortal god emperor's battleship was flying southwest of the ruins, about 1,000,000 miles away. Originally, the path of the divine ship would not have passed through the ruins, so the immortal god emperor would not have been able to see the traces left behind by Zhi Tianxing. However, the thousands of beast race god kings under Overlord Yongfeng's command all fled in all directions in order to avoid Zhi Tianxing's pursuit. One of the groups consisted of more than 200 beast race god kings. As they were fleeing, they happened to be in the path of the immortal god emperor's battleship. In fact, the thousands of beast race god kings had been divided into dozens of small groups. Each group had 100 or 200 people. These groups were all fleeing south. Many of them were fleeing southeast, southwest and due south. Thus, it was normal for one of the groups to run into the immortal god emperor's battleship. Whoosh! The immortal god emperor's battleship suddenly stopped in the sky. On the surface, the battleship did not seem to have changed, but the people inside had all begun to move and enter battle mode. 30,000 miles away, a dazzling divine light was flying over in a panic. There were over 200 beast god kings in the divine light, and some of them were even injured. They seemed to be in rather horrible and miserable shapes. However, the immortal god emperor's battleship had remained invisible and had concealed its aura. The 200 beast race god kings who were fleeing for their lives did not notice it at all, nor did they know that there was an even greater danger waiting for them. Thus they were quickly met with tragedy. Within the battleship, the immortal god emperor noticed the abnormality and guessed that there must be some clues or information behind those 200 beast race god kings. Thus, he decisively ordered the battleship to open fire. The battleship activated its divine cannons, and after a short period of charging, It fired more than 300 beams of divine power. Boom, boom, boom. A deafening explosion reverberated through the heavens. The beams of divine flame carried with them the power to destroy everything as they slammed into the crowd of beast race god kings. The 200 or so beast god kings were caught off guard, so they suffered a sudden, devastating attack. They did not even have the chance to resist or dodge, so they obviously suffered heavy casualties. There was a dazzling flash of divine light, and then a rain of blood and severed limbs rained down from the sky. More than half of the beast race god kings were killed by the battleship's cannon fire. The 100 beast race god kings who were lucky enough to survive were also severely injured. They fled in panic and despair. At this moment, the immortal god emperor issued another order. The battleship's cabin doors opened, and more than 1,000 elite god kings flew out and scattered in every direction. In a short 100 breaths of time, the 1,000 elite god kings had captured nearly 100 beast race god kings and brought them back to the battleship. The immortal god emperor had been waiting in the main hall of the battleship for a long time. Once the beast race god kings were brought back, he would personally interrogate them and obtain the information he needed. Chapter 4791. Most of the beast race god kings were stubborn and refused to reveal their secrets no matter what kind of torture they suffered. However, there were always some beasts who were afraid of death. In order to survive, they told the others everything that had happened, including the information about Lord Zhou Xian. The undying god emperor was very excited to get the information he wanted. Previously, I was worried that the beast overlords would come and interfere after receiving the news and ruin my grand plan. Now it seems that this is not a bad thing. At the very least, those stupid beast overlords can still help me stop him and delay his escape. That guy is not far away. I will be able to catch up to him in a few more days. However, there is one thing worth noting. The battle between him and Zhou Xian overlord is in the northeast. This means that he has changed his escape route. If I continue to head north in a straight line, I will never be able to catch up to him. These thoughts flashed through the undying god emperor's mind. He had a new plan for his next move. Without hesitation, he hurriedly ordered the battleship to change its course and head northeast for a distance. 3/4 of an hour later, the battleship arrived at the ruins, which were tens of thousands of kilometers in radius. Looking at the devastated land and sensing the remnant aura of the god emperor, the undying god emperor calmed down. This is the divine aura he left behind. There is no doubt about it. With the facts confirmed, the undying god emperor no longer had any doubts. He ordered his soldiers to kill all the beast race god kings. The beast race god kings were all terrified, especially the ones who had revealed the truth. They all started cursing furiously. They cursed the undying god emperor for not keeping his word and for doing such a shameless thing. They cursed him to die a horrible death. However, the immortal god emperor turned a deaf ear to them. The soldiers under his command quickly shut the mouths of the beast race's god kings. They would never be able to speak again. After all the captives were killed, their corpses were thrown out of the warship and into the scorched earth, making the ruins even more bloody. The battleship swaggered off, streaking across the sky like a stream of light, quickly disappearing into the horizon. Once the immortal god emperor had determined the direction and route they would take, he sped up and gave chase, full of anticipation. The white dragon steered the god-slaying battleship forward. Tianxia stayed in the distorted space-time and cultivated. He first refined Zhou Xian overlord's quintessence shard not only to absorb some divine Tao laws and absorb some divine Tao laws, but also to prepare for condensing the sixth Tao rhyme. More importantly, he wanted to refine Lord Zhou Qian's memories and understand the power structure of this unknown place. Only by knowing how many beast lords were here, what realm they were at, and what they were doing, could he have a clearer grasp of the situation. Without a doubt, Tianxia had done it. It took him 10 days to refine Lord Zhou Qian's quintessence fragment in the distorted space-time. He had absorbed a lot of divine power and he had also lost 50 divine Tao laws. Presently, the number of laws he grasped was as many as 2,800. Naturally, his strength had increased and he was much more powerful than before. However, what he cared about the most was that he had obtained Lord Zhou Qian's memories, which gave him a clearer understanding of the power structure and situation of this unknown place. Previously, he knew that there were 5 overlords in this unknown place, and he knew the name and realm of each overlord. The latest news he had was that the other overlords had started to move. Other than Lord Zhou Xian, who he had just killed, Lord Songlu was also on his way to kill him. The other two overlords were further away, and they might not be able to make it in time. However, based on Lord Zhou Xian's understanding of the other two, they would definitely not sit by and do nothing. They would definitely want a share of the loot, so they should be on their way. Lord Songlu, Middle Realm God Emperor, has condensed 5 Dao rhymes, and has many beast race god kings under his command. He should be able to gather at least 4,000 god kings in a short time. Ji Tianqing silently analyzed as these thoughts flashed through his mind. He knew very well that he was most likely to meet Lord Songlu in the upcoming battle. As for the Pantheon of Immortality and the people of the Taiyu Shrine, they should not be a threat to him for the time being. Unknowingly, an entire day had passed in the outside world. The god-slaying warship had traveled 100 million miles to the north, and it was still in stealth mode, concealing its aura. The immortal God Emperor's warship had been following Ji Tianqing from behind. However, this warship was slightly faster than the god-slaying warship. The distance between the two warships had shrunk from the initial 3 to 4 million miles. After a day, the distance between the two warships had shrunk to 2,300,000 miles. To the left of the immortal God Emperor's warship, about 20 million miles away, there was another warship speeding along. That was the Taiyu God Emperor's warship. Not only him but also the 4th and 5th Palace Masters were on it. As for the 2nd and 3rd Palace Masters, they were still 10 million miles behind. The experts of the two god palaces were pursuing Ji Tianqing, forming a long line that passed through the middle of the unknown. Only when the heavens looked down on this unknown land could they clearly see the overall situation. To the right of the god-slaying warship, about 5 million miles away, a streak of divine light was rapidly approaching. Even further to the north, several 100 million miles away, were two groups led by the God Emperor's experts, marching south. Simply put, the god-slaying warship seemed safe for now. But in reality, the warship was being pursued from behind, and the beast race lords were rushing to intercept it. Ji Tianqing had never escaped danger, constantly hovering on the edge of life and death. If he made the slightest mistake, there was a chance that he would die. What happened next proved this point. 4 hours later, as the god-slaying warship was advancing, it encountered a dazzling streak of divine light. That streak of divine light drifted over from the horizon, as if it had long since discovered the god-slaying warship and was charging straight at it. The white dragon had been vigilant this entire time, and when he saw that streak of divine light flying over, he became nervous. Without hesitation, he had the warship maintain its concealment while steering it to the right. He wanted to see if the other party had discovered him, or if it was just a coincidence. In the end, that streak of divine light also changed directions and continued to charge at the god-slaying warship. Reality proved that the expert in that streak of divine light had long since discovered the god-slaying warship and locked onto it. The white dragon hurriedly increased his speed, and at the same time he woke up his cultivating master. He knew that another beast race lord had arrived. A great battle was inevitable. Chapter 4792. Ji Tianqing was at a critical juncture of his closed-door cultivation. He had just condensed the embryonic form of his 6th Taoist rhyme and was about to take the opportunity to condense his Taoist rhyme and complete the 6th Taoist rhyme in one go. However, Bai Long's call interrupted his cultivation. He could only leave the distorted space-time and appear in the cockpit of the battleship. Swoosh! Ji Tianqing appeared behind Bai Long in a flash of white light. Without waiting for Bai Long to report the situation, he released his divine perception and spread it out. After covering a radius of tens of thousands of miles, he immediately saw the situation clearly. Damn it, why is there another one? Ji Tianqing frowned. A cold light flashed in his eyes and his body emitted a strong murderous intent. Although he had expected to encounter 1 or 2 beast overlords along the way, he did not expect it to happen so quickly. He did not need to guess to know that the God Emperor of the Beast Tribe in the divine light ahead was definitely Lord Songlu. According to his estimation, Lord Songlu would leave his territory and come here to kill him at least half a day later. Since the time was half a day earlier, one could imagine how anxious Lord Songlu was and how impatient he was. The divine light was only 30,000 miles away from the god-slaying battleship. Ji Tianxing's divine perception had already penetrated the divine light and saw the many figures in it. As he expected, there were more than 2,000 figures in the divine light. They were basically all godly king realm experts of the beast tribe. The leader was the most powerful and had reached the middle level of the god emperor. It was a huge grayish-black bird with a wingspan of almost 10,000 feet. It was as huge as a mountain and looked like a divine eagle or a vulture. It exuded a fierce aura. The other 2,000 godly king realm beasts came from different clans and had different appearances. Of course, this was not important. Ji Tianxing only needed to confirm their identities and origins as well as their numbers and strength. Lord Songlu's wings lit up with divine light and his body emitted a strong murderous intent. He was about to attack in the next moment. The 2,000 godly king realm beasts also got into an attacking formation ready to attack. A great battle was about to break out. Ji Tianxing decided to make the first move. He turned invisible and flew out of the god-slaying battleship into the sky. He used all of his power, his left hand clenched into a fist and punched out a mountain-sized shadow of a dragon and elephant. His right hand swung the sword and slashed out a 1,000-feet-long golden sword towards the divine light. Thus, in the seemingly calm sky, a mountain-sized fist shadow and a gigantic golden sword light suddenly appeared. Within the divine light, Overlord Heron and more than 2,000 beasts revealed astonished and shocked expressions. This was especially so for Lord Heron. He knew that his opponent wasn't someone to be trifled with, yet he actually dared to take the initiative to attack. His expression grew even more solemn. The beast race god kings who reacted quickly all unleashed their divine powers and used all sorts of divine abilities to counter the dragon elephant fist shadow and the 1,000-feet-long sword light. Lord Heron did not stay idle either. He released hundreds of sharp blades of divine light, which rained down like a rain of arrows, attacking the fist shadows and sword radiance. Boom! Ping ping ping! In the next instant, the divine light that filled the sky clashed with the dragon elephant fist and sword, producing a deafening boom that reverberated throughout the world. Unsurprisingly, the divine art attacks released by the beast race god kings were all shattered by the dragon elephant fist. The hundreds of sharp blades of divine light released by Lord Heron were also mostly destroyed by the giant sword. They turned into divine light fragments that scattered in all directions. The draconic elephant divine fist and the 1,000-feet-long giant sword did not dissipate, but their power and speed had decreased significantly. Lord Heron had successfully dodged the gigantic sword's attack, but the draconic elephant divine fist and the gigantic sword had struck the divine light. They had also struck more than 200 unlucky godly monarchs. Boom! Amidst the loud boom, the dazzling divine light was shattered. Fragments of divine light splattered across the sky, producing a powerful shockwave. The 200 or so unlucky beast race god kings were instantly smashed into pieces by the draconic elephant divine fist and the giant sword. They died instantly. Before Lord Heron and company even saw their opponent, they were already intimidated by their opponent. More than 200 of them were killed or injured. This caused the Heron overlord to lose face and he flew into a rage on the spot. He roared angrily and locked onto the god-slaying battleship's aura. He opened his sharp mouth and spewed out a few streaks of divine flames. White dragons steered the god-slaying battleship. He wanted to dodge, but he was powerless. He could only watch helplessly as the divine flames struck the battleship's defensive barrier. Boom! With a dull boom, the entire god-slaying battleship was engulfed by the blazing divine flames. However, the divine light barrier trembled violently. After shaking dozens of times, it gradually calmed down. Apart from cracks appearing on the barrier's surface and greatly reducing its strength, it was fine. The powerful impact pushed the god-slaying battleship dozens of miles away. White Dragon steered the battleship. After it stabilized in the sky, he hurriedly activated the array formation to repair the divine light barrier. On the other side, Lord Heron had already found the culprit. He locked onto Ji Tianxing's aura. Even if Ji Tianxing remained invisible, he could still detect Ji Tianxing's location and determine Ji Tianxing's strength. Middle stage God Emperor. His strength is similar to mine. It should be him. Lord Heron quickly identified his target and ignored the god-slaying battleship. He used all his strength and launched an attack on Ji Tianxing. He flapped his wide wings and opened his sharp mouth. He spewed out more than a dozen pillars of divine flames. He also released divine blades that filled the sky as he charged at Ji Tianxing. Ji Tianxing showed no mercy. He brandished his sword and used Sword Dao divine powers to fight Lord Heron. The 2,000 beast race godly monarchs could not see the invisible Ji Tianxing. They could not lock onto his location, so they naturally could not attack. They could only turn their attention to the god-slaying battleship and attack it with all their might. They swore to destroy the battleship. Of course, White Dragon would not sit still and wait for death. He had already activated the divine cannons and launched a fierce bombardment at the beast race godly monarchs. Bam, 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 bam. 360 dazzling pillars of divine power lit up the sky for tens of thousands of miles. They enveloped all the beast race godly monarchs, clearly illuminating their terrified and despairing faces. Even though they desperately used their divine powers and supreme skills to form massive shields to block the divine cannon's attacks. But it was all for naught. Following a loud rumble, the divine light barriers of the beast race godly monarchs shattered. Dozens of unlucky beast race godly monarchs were killed on the spot by the divine cannons. They were pulverized and not even their corpses were left. Hundreds of beast race godly monarchs managed to survive, but they were heavily injured by the divine cannons. They were covered in blood and looked extremely miserable. Such casualties did not deter the 2,000 beast race godly monarchs. Instead, it angered them even more. They quickly spread out in all directions in the sky and formed a massive encirclement that surrounded the god-slaying battleship. Chapter 4793. The battle began and it was extremely intense. The battlefield was split into two parts. On one side, more than 2,000 beast godly monarchs surrounded the god-slaying battleship. On the other side, Lord Heron and Ji Tianxing were locked in an intense battle. The surrounding 15,000 kilometers had become a battlefield. It was enveloped in dazzling divine light as countless divine technique projections shuttled back and forth, crisscrossing each other. Loud rumbles rang out incessantly as the divine light in the sky flickered. Destructive shockwaves of divine power spread outwards like ripples. After exchanging a few blows, the outcome of the battle became apparent. Ji Tianxing's combat strength was stronger than Lord Heron's. He suppressed him from the very beginning and forced him to retreat. He could only defend himself tirelessly. After exchanging 6 or 7 blows, Lord Heron could not hold on any longer and quickly retreated. 10 blows later, Ji Tianxing pierced through Lord Heron's left wing. He began to bleed and his strength began to decline. As time passed, Lord Songlu's defeat was a foregone conclusion. Even being killed by Ji Tianxing was unavoidable. On the other side, the 2,000 beast godly monarchs surrounded the god-slaying battleship. It was extremely successful. Although the god-slaying battleship was an emperor-level divine artifact with powerful offensive strength and defense, it was still a 1,000-foot-long battleship. It was not agile enough. Even though White Dragon controlled the battleship with all his might and constantly launched counterattacks, he did manage to kill a few hundred beast godly monarchs and injure many others. However, this number of casualties was still acceptable for the 2,000 beast godly monarchs. Furthermore, it only infuriated them and made them charge even more valiantly. They formed an encirclement and worked together to form a battle formation. They released their divine ability attacks one after another and rained down on the god-slaying battleship. The god-slaying battleship's divine light barrier would be broken every 30 seconds. Then White Dragon had no choice but to control the formation and reform it. The first 2 or 3 times were still fine. However, after a few more times, the god-slaying battleship expended too much energy and its strength began to decline. White Dragon had no choice but to adjust his counterattack strategy. He launched fewer counterattacks and focused more on defense. As time passed, the god-slaying battleship's situation became more and more passive. Perhaps after 15 minutes or an hour, the god-slaying battleship's defenses would not last any longer. It would definitely be breached by the beast godly monarchs. White Dragon was filled with anxiety and worry, but he couldn't disturb his master and distract him. He had no choice but to send a voice transmission to awaken his master's wife and god emperor. After a short while, 3 divine lights flashed and appeared in the cockpit of the battleship one after another. Whoosh! Whoosh. Great Wisdom God Emperor Yunyao and Jiku heard that Ji Tianqing was ambushed and they ended their secluded cultivation. They released their divine sense to quickly assess the situation on the battlefield. Then God Emperor Bo Ri charged out of the god-slaying battleship and brandished his sword at Overlord Song Lu, assisting Ji Tianqing in dealing with his opponent quickly. Meanwhile, Yun Yao and Jiku rushed out of the god-slaying battleship and brandished their swords and divine spears. They charged at the surrounding beast race god kings to reduce the pressure on the god-slaying battleship. Such a distribution of manpower was the most appropriate. Hanya had the strength of a mid-stage god emperor. Ji Tianqing could already suppress Lord Heron. Once she joined the battle, Ji Tianqing would be like a tiger that had grown wings. He would completely defeat Lord Heron and end the battle faster. As for the god-slaying battleship, even if it was at a disadvantage, it would not be defeated in a short time. With Yun Yao and Jiku's help, they could neutralize the attacks of many beast godly monarchs. They could also slaughter a large number of them to lessen the pressure on the god-slaying battleship. This plan quickly took effect. After the godly monarchs joined the battle, they fought side by side with Ji Tianqing. They attacked Lord Heron together. Lord Heron was shocked and angry. He knew that he was no match for the other party, so he stopped attacking and tried his best to escape. However, Ji Tianqing chased after him relentlessly, suppressing him so that he could not escape. The Prajna God Emperor also assisted from the side, constantly releasing divine abilities and ultimate skills, all of which were aimed at Lord Heron's fatal spots. In just a few rounds, Lord Heron was pierced with dozens of bloody holes. Its wings were also cut into pieces and its body was covered in blood. Due to its heavy injuries, its strength was greatly reduced. Blood flowed from all over its body and it constantly let out painful howls. Ji Tianqing's pursuit became more and more ferocious. The Prajna God Emperor also used all of his power to launch a storm of attacks. Lord Heron complained incessantly after being beaten up. He begged for mercy several times or tried to negotiate with Ji Tianqing, but there was no response. Ji Tianqing was too lazy to pay attention to it. From the moment it decided to attack, it was destined to die. There wasn't any deep hatred between the two of them. It was just that Lord Heron was unlucky and had a death wish. It knew that the chosen one, Kenshin, was a difficult character to deal with, but it still dared to intercept him alone. This was confidence and arrogance. Meanwhile, Ji Tianqing had been in a hurry to increase his strength and condense his sixth Taoist rhyme. He just so happened to lack some of the God Emperor's divine spark fragments. Thus Lord Heron was doomed. Another 30 breaths of time passed. Lord Heron resisted Ji Tianqing and Prajna's attacks while retreating north. It had already retreated 200,000 kilometers. When the two sides shifted the battlefield, the mountains and forests along the way were all destroyed, leaving behind only a scene of desolation. Smoke and dust filled the world, and it was also filled with the aura of berserk divine power. Lord Heron's injuries were extremely tragic. Its divine body was on the verge of collapse. It was already an arrow at the end of its flight and could die at any time. The Prajna God Emperor took advantage of the opportunity to pursue and exchange another blow with Lord Heron, forcing it back dozens of kilometers. Ji Tianqing, who was ready to attack, took the opportunity to chase after it. He used his trump card and launched the final attack. Sword of Annihilation. It drew on the power of the five elemental world and condensed a giant golden sword of light that was tens of thousands of meters long. It carried the power to destroy everything and slashed down from the sky toward Lord Heron. Lord Heron knew that its aura had been locked onto by the sword. There was no way it could dodge or withstand it. If the sword slashed down, it would definitely die. Since the outcome was already decided and could not be changed, the only thing it could do was send a message before it died. It used its fastest speed to send a message to inform the other orc overlord and give it a warning. Not for anything else, it only hoped that those two lords would not be as impatient as it and Zhou Xian Lord, who went into battle alone and ended up dead. If the two overlords could join forces and plan carefully, it was very likely that they could defeat Kenshin. Of course, if they could join forces to kill Kenshin, it could be considered as revenge for it. Whoosh. When the Sword of Annihilation descended and enveloped Lord Heron's figure, a spiritual light soared into the sky and disappeared into the depths of the vault of heaven. The message was sent, but Lord Heron was also swallowed by the Sword of Annihilation. Boom! A dull sound rang out and a dazzling splash of blood. Lord Heron's body collapsed, turning into fragments that filled the sky. Blood splattered across the sky. Even its godhead was shattered on the spot. /book_15878/Path of Immortality. Chapter 4794. Just like that, Overlord Song Lu fell. His godhead shattered into a dozen shards that scattered across the sky. They were 200,000 kilometers away from the battlefield. The 2,000 beast race god kings did not see the scene of Overlord Song Lu's death, nor were they aware of the news for the time being. After the battle ended, Ji Tianxing picked up Overlord Song Lu's godhead shards with a wave of his hand and left with Xianxia God Emperor. When the two returned to the battlefield, the beast race god kings were still attacking the Godslayer battleship. However, the situation on the battlefield had changed. The number of beast race god kings had decreased significantly. The huge encirclement still existed, but the number of beast race god kings had decreased to a little over 1,800. Yunyao and Jiku were still fighting with all their might. They kept reaping the lives of the beast race god kings and helped the Godslayer battleship relieve some of the pressure. White Dragon also controlled the Godslayer battleship and fired back with its divine cannons. At the same time, he had to repair the godlight barrier of the battleship. Currently, both sides were evenly matched. Although the Godslayer battleship was surrounded, it would not be in any danger for the time being. Yunyao and Jiku were also in peak condition. They were not injured, nor had they expended much of their divine power. Seeing Ji Tianxing and Xianxia God Emperor return, Yunyao, Jiku and White Dragon perked up. They did not need to ask to know that Overlord Song Lu had been killed by Ji Tianxing. This allowed them to heave a sigh of relief. When they attacked the beast race god kings again, they were even more confident. As for the 1,800 beast race god kings, they were filled with shock. Their emotions were extremely complicated. Seeing Ji Tianxing and Xianxia God Emperor return, some of the smarter beast race god kings had already guessed that Overlord Song Lu had been killed. Even if he had not been killed, he had been defeated and had fled with serious injuries. Since that was the case, how could they be a match for Kenshin without Overlord Song Lu's support? Some of the beast race god kings were still shouting and roaring. They looked like they were about to charge forward and attack Ji Tianxing and Xianxia God Emperor. However, a portion of the god kings of the beast race retreated stealthily, preparing to turn around and flee. As long as Ji Tianxing was willing, he could bring Pan Ruo, Yunyao and Jiku to kill all 1,800 god kings. However, that would waste too much time and there was not much meaning to it. Therefore, Ji Tianxing directly took out Lord Heron's quintessence fragment and released a sacred pressure. He coldly shouted, "I've already killed Lord Heron. Do you still want to put up a resistance and seek your own death?" His loud and dignified voice reverberated through the sky, causing all the god kings to see stars and gape in shock. They couldn't believe that this was true. They all thought that Ji Tianxing was bluffing. However, the quintessence fragment in Ji Tianxing's hand wouldn't lie. It clearly had Lord Heron's aura, so the 1,000-odd orc god kings had no choice but to believe it. Therefore, no one doubted the authenticity of the news anymore. They were all filled with fear and panic as they turned around and fled. Since Lord Heron was dead, what was the point of continuing to besiege Kenshin? If they didn't flee, they would soon be slaughtered by Kenshin and buried with Lord Heron. In the blink of an eye, the 1,800 beast race god kings scattered in all directions, fleeing for their lives. Ji Tianxing, Pan Ruo and the others didn't pursue them. They allowed the god kings to escape and return to the Godslayer battleship. No one was injured in the previous battle. They only used up some divine power. After returning to the battleship, Ji Tianxing, Pan Ruo and the others entered the distorted spacetime of the Divine Pagoda to continue cultivating in seclusion. Bai Long continued to pilot the Godslayer battleship. He concealed his tracks and aura as he rushed north. In the distorted spacetime under the blood flame sacred tree, Pan Ruo, the God Emperor Yunyao and Jiku had all gone to cultivate. Ji Tianxing held Lord Heron's quintessence fragment and pondered silently. Of the 5 beast overlords in this unknown land, 3 have already been slain by me. They all tried to kill me alone, but I killed them one by one. Before Lord Heron died, he sent out a message. It's probably to inform the other 2 overlords, hoping that they can avenge him. As long as those 2 overlords aren't idiots, they won't act rashly. They definitely won't dare to try to kill me alone. They'll definitely work together and won't act rashly. I shouldn't have to worry about their ambushes for the time being. I only have to worry about the Pantheon of Immortality and the Taiyu Shrine. In other words, he would be safe for a period of time after killing Lord Heron. However, Ji Tianqing had a vague premonition that the next time he was intercepted by the God Emperor, it wouldn't be so easy. Once they tried to kill him, it would either be the two beast overlords working together or the powerhouses of the two great temples. In short, the next time he was intercepted, it would definitely be very dangerous. His top priority now was to refine Lord Heron's quintessence fragment as soon as possible and try to condense the sixth Taoist rhyme as soon as possible. After making up his mind, he put away his various thoughts and began to cultivate without any distractions. He first refined Lord Heron's quintessence fragment, absorbing his divine power and divine Tao laws and refining his divine soul memories. The distorted spacetime was very quiet. Everyone was focused on cultivating and forgot about the passage of time. Unknowingly, half a month had passed. Ji Tianqing had successfully refined Lord Heron's quintessence fragment. His divine power had increased further, and he had also obtained more than 40 divine Tao laws. The number of divine Tao laws he had mastered now reached 2,850. He only needed to master 150 more divine Tao laws to gather 3,000 great Taos. In addition, he had refined Lord Heron's divine soul memories and had a deeper understanding of the situation in the unknown lands. The more divine Tao laws he mastered, the more solid his foundation for condensing the sixth Taoist rhyme would be. Therefore, he continued to cultivate in seclusion and focused on condensing the Taoist rhyme. Not long ago, before he had killed Lord Zhou Xian, he had condensed the sixth Taoist rhyme with his own strength and comprehension. If he had cultivated step by step, he would have needed at least 100 years to condense the sixth Taoist rhyme. However, it was different now. He had killed two beast overlords in the Middle God Emperor realm and refined their quintessence fragments. This was very helpful to him and could also save him a lot of time. Only half a month had passed in the outside world, but he had already cultivated in seclusion in the distorted spacetime for 2 years. The results of his cultivation were very obvious. His sixth Taoist rhyme had basically taken shape and could be considered to have been successfully condensed. However, he still needed many years of cultivation and accumulation to fill and perfect the sixth Taoist rhyme. According to his estimation, it would take at least 20 years for the sixth Taoist rhyme to be truly completed. At the same time, the god-slaying battleship flew for another half a month in the unknown lands and had already arrived in the northern region. In a few days they would be able to rush out of the unknown lands and enter the Chaos Sea. This region was the territory of the remaining two beast overlords. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.